And what we learnt was that when we initially got there, we thought we were fairly well trained till we worked with the SAS for a week. And we realised we were a bunch of rabble barging our way through the scrub because we wanted to get from point A to point B. I had no idea what I was in for. Probably wouldn't have gone if I did. The boss said, no, we've got to go this way, and bang, we had a bloke wounded and a bloke killed. And that's been the way, the Australian way all the time, by aggressive patrolling. Not just sitting in your fort, but getting out there and making sure they don't come anywhere near you. I probably was a naive young man, probably idealistic, and thought, well, I still do think that what I was doing was important.
The first thing I'm going to ask you to do is just give a very brief summary of the main points in your life. So are you able to do that now?
Mm-hmm. I was a country boy. I was born in Cavanough, New South Wales, on the Murray. And my father was a railway worker, so he had 4 sons. And so I grew up in various railway towns in the country, at Cavanough, Junee, Cootamundra. And Cootamundra I finished my schooling. I went to both Catholic and state school, state high school. From there I joined the public service in the country, the forestry, I remember. And only working 18 months, then I went into the Army, National Service. Was in there 9 months, then went to Vietnam for 12 months. Come home, got out, went back to the forestry at Sydney. So I lived in Sydney for years, got married, then left Sydney and moved to a place called Mathara, which was out near the Murray again. Then up to Batlow, across to Cootamundra and to Wagga. Just then working, and I joined the reserves in about 1980 at Wagga, and spent about 20 years in the reserves as well as my job with the public service. And then I retired in 98, I think it was. And that's it.
Were you aware of what was happening in Vietnam at that time?
No, not really. In the early 60s it was still, no, I wasn't aware at all. I mean, there was stuff on TV, but I didn't take much notice of it. Really, I don't think I knew where it was. And probably if I knew about it, that's the problem with life. It's good just to go with something. If you research and know all about it, you probably then say, oh, well, I'm not going to do that. Whereas if you know nothing, you just enjoy the journey. No matter where it takes you. To me, that's always been my philosophy in life, always to take a risk. That's probably why we moved about so much. The job was down there. Oh, okay, well, we'll go down there and see what it's like. So, didn't even in the 60s, no. I was aware that there was a groundswell of opposition. I mean, I can still remember LBJ and what I remember, the Lincoln Continentals, that right, the big cars they had for him. One had been splattered in paint. 20 minutes later, he wouldn't even know there was paint on it. So I remember that. But I really didn't think about or engage anyone about the Vietnam War. It was just something that was happening somewhere.
Had you had friends or relatives who'd been in the army?
My father had this fellow come and stay. He was a captain, and I remember some stories he told us about the Second World War when he came across a Japanese soldier. But my brother went to Vietnam before I did. He went to the army in 65. That might have influenced me, because I think what I was influenced more by was growing up in the 50s, the movies, all about the Second World War, and war movies had a romantic view of warfare. And even the musicals, and the sailors in uniforms getting the girls, the fellows coming back home on the boats and treated as heroes and marching down the streets. And I probably formed in my brain was that going off to war, fighting your country was something, a noble cause, something to do.
And I think we sort of touched on it before, but I sort of want to ask you what your reasons at the time were for volunteering for national service. What was going through your head?
A lot of silly things, I suppose. Look, I didn't tell many people I volunteered for national service. I guess it was I was talking about the movie in the book, A Man Called Horse. And we also talked about all those war movies out of the 50s, how war was an honourable thing, and going off into battle for your country is a very noble thing, and I don't think people realise how a noble cause that was. And I think too, I probably wanted to grow up a bit. I mean, I was living in a country town, been a country boy, and I was reading somewhere about what takes a boy from a boy to a man, and I felt I need to do something. And if I joined the regular army, I was in for 3 years. This shows you what a methodical person I am. And I think about things. With national service, you're in for 2 years, you come back and you are guaranteed a job. And you're only in for 2 years, so you go into a bit of training, go to Vietnam. So for whatever reason why I want to go to Vietnam, I think it was because it would probably make a man of me. So I inquired about volunteering for national service. And I really didn't, I don't know who I wrote to, maybe the Department of the Army, I don't know. And I get this letter saying to present myself for a medical. And so I did that, and then I got a letter, and I kept that letter for years, and I've lost track of it, to present myself at Cavanough railway station and get such a train to Wagga. So I was in, and I think that's why I was travelling a lot better than someone who didn't want to go into the army and was, I was going to say conscripted, but they weren't really conscripted, it was national service. And when people use the term conscription, that's not really correct. Certainly not amongst the infantry, because if you imagine a group of blokes and you had these 3 or 4 blokes who didn't want to be there, well, if they don't want to be there, you don't want them there, because when the time comes, you've got to rely on them. So certainly in the infantry, you had the option. Because I remember, after all the training, I remember the boss called me in, how do you feel about going to Vietnam? And of course, after this stage, we've been doing some horrendous training up in Townsville. And you're like a prize fighter, you know, ready to do battle. And, no way. Yeah, want to get over here and get amongst it, because that's what you're training for. You know, you just, this programming's working. But I believe at any stage, anybody could have got out if they said, look, this isn't for me. So I don't believe we had the term conscription, we had national service. And if you didn't want to be in the infantry, sure, you could be in the support services where the risk wasn't there. So there might have been a lot of blokes there against their will, but certainly amongst the infantry, you didn't want to be there, you weren't there. I probably was a naive young man, probably idealistic, and thought, well, I still do think that what I was doing was important.
And I might just go back and ask you about arriving in Vietnam, where you left from and what that trip over was like.
Where I, sorry?
Where you left from and from Australia when you first arrived.
Oh yeah, because we were in Townsville, we flew out. Some battalions went over on the Sydney, but we flew. And therefore we flew in stages, and I think by company. So I was in A company too, right? So we went out first. And we flew out about 2 a.m. That way there was no demonstrators at 2 a.m. My parents came to see me off, and they travelled up to town. They'd never been to Queensland before, and they travelled to Townsville. And my father befriended the bloke at the local pub, because I was staying at the Salvation Army People's Palace. Excuse me. And my father befriended the bloke at the pub, and they were catching the train out later that morning, and he let them have this room because their son was going to Vietnam. So there was a lot of generosity and support around. It's just people didn't advertise the fact. Anyway, they saw me off, and I remember we were on the runway, and we weren't allowed to carry 2 bags. We had our field equipment and then some civilian clothes and whatever in one other bag. And and they were told to fill out this form about what the weight was. And they said, look, there's a limit, so make sure the two figures you write down don't add up to the limit. So who knows how much weight we had on board. And it was a large plane with 4 engines. On the wing, I forget what type it was now, might have been 707. And someone said, there's always someone an expert, someone said, the runway at Townsville is just long enough. And we seem to be taxiing for a long time. Then we're gunning down the runway and we seem to be just not taking off, and we're all looking at each other thinking, well, are we too heavy? And then we just took off. Then we landed in Singapore to have breakfast. Now, because we were going off to war, we had our army uniforms on, and we had to take a shirt off and put on a different shirt. And we went to the airport in I don't even know, in Singapore to have breakfast. So why they bothered doing that, I don't know. And we each ordered a can of Tiger beer, I remember. Got a sample of local beer, even though we're only going to be there for an hour. So we left Townsville at 2 a.m. We had stopped at Darwin. I remember we got out there, I don't know where we stopped at Darwin from, but I remember the heat just hitting us. Then we stopped at Singapore and had breakfast. No one had slept, of course, so we must have looked a wreck, but we had like Hawaiian shirts on the top of the uniform. And it didn't see much in the plane because it was sort of cloudy and raining when we sort of like was dawn when we landed. So we had a feed, bacon and eggs or something, and I was with my mates, and we were walking towards the doorway. All I wanted to do was to have a look at the place. Well, next minute this big security guy must have thought we were going to do a runner. Stands in front of us, and we realised we were being controlled. I wasn't wasn't overt security like you see now, but as soon as we were heading for the door, there's these guys in front of us. So then we flew to Tonsanut in Saigon airport. They said that's one of the busiest in the world, and they decided to feed us there again. So I don't know the time frame. And we had these RAF lunch on. Beautiful, they put everything in. And the thing that we noticed, there was these Vietnamese people walking in the airport. And we'd been in Townsville about 9 months, so it gets fairly hot in Townsville. As soon as we stepped off that plane, it was whack, just the heat hit you. Very vivid sensation of the heat. And then we got on the Caribou, smaller aircraft, and flew to Nui Dat. But my biggest recollection is that heat just going whack when you got out of the air-conditioned plane. Just straight away, you just sweat, you know. And then we arrived at Nui Dat, up to where this tent was very musty, very dark. They were old tents with old thing. We cleaned them up a bit, but basically they still remained that way all the time we were there. So we weren't living there much. So, but it was better than sleeping on the ground like we were out in the bush. So. But the heat was the big thing. Very hot.
Was this your first time overseas?
Yes, it was the first time out of... I'd only been to Victoria, where one of my aunties lived in Melbourne. Never been to Queensland before. Never been in a plane before I got in the army. Had never seen colour television. I think I saw colour television in Bangkok. So I didn't consider myself naive, but I know, looking back, I was. I was just there, experiencing it, you know. So, very good experience, you know. I don't regret it at all.
You said that your brother had joined up in 65, was it?
Yeah, I'm not sure of the date, but yeah, he was Nasho, yeah.
Did he volunteer, or...?
No, he was Nasho. He went over very early in the war, and he was stationed at Vung Tau, and I remember he sent slides home, and he was involved with transport. And when I went over, I went to this place in Vung Tau with my camera when we were on leave on RNC, and I photographed the buildings that were brand new when he was there. And they're made out of wood, not painted, so they'd all gone that grey, faded sort of colour, you know. I tried to take photos of what I remembered. And but even us in Nui Dat, we were still in tents, so would have been all right down Vung Tau in a hut. Yeah. So that probably influenced me. I probably looked up to my brother and decided, well, maybe this is what I should do. The only difference was if you're going to go off to war, you may as well go the whole hog. So I volunteered for infantry. People thought I was mad, but why not? If you're going to experience war, experience the fullest, you know. And the other thing I would have liked to have been was a chopper pilot. Other than that, infantry was the way to go. Would have loved to have been in one of those helicopters. Would have been great.
Did he offer you any sort of advice, or did he offer you any information about the people or the...
No. Well, I was working away from home at the time, even though I was coming home weekends and stuff. I don't think he was living at home then. I think he'd come home. No, I just can't recall now, but certainly no, we never really discussed it. Isn't that funny? He's my big brother. He should have said, now listen, just be careful, do this and don't do it. I don't recall him ever saying that. He should have, shouldn't he?
Not even about girls or anything like that?
No, nothing. Isn't that strange? I'll have to ask him about that. Why did you tell me not to go in infantry? It's your fault.
So you said that lots of your instructors had already been in Vietnam.
Yep.
How were you briefed for the sort of combat? How were you briefed for the culture, and what you were instructed about, fraternisation with the locals and things?
We were given some information on the culture, but really, it was nothing. Looking back, we probably never even listened anyway. And it was probably like when we were going on leave, they'd give us talks about car accidents. They took no notice of it. So I guess I knew nothing about the place. In reality, I mean, that they might have tried to, but really had no idea what I was in for. Probably wouldn't have gone if I did. But we were tightly controlled. We lived in a base camp at Nui Dat, separated from the locals. There was no locals in the base camp. There may have been the odd South Vietnamese soldier. No civilians. Yes, that's right. Whereas, say, the American bases, they had civilians working there. Well, we didn't have any South Vietnamese or any Vietnamese with us. Ones that were there we would see from time to time in uniform. And we would go out for 3 or 4 weeks on an operation, come back, pack ready to go again. We get 3 days and 2 nights in Vung Tau, back and out again. And in the 12-month period, we did 318 days on operation. So we were just continually in the field. So therefore, there's no way we could mix with the locals. Even when we were on leave down in Vung Tau, we were tightly controlled. We were either staying out at out on the beach with where the Australian base was, or we're staying in town in a French villa, and we had to be back by a certain time. There was a curfew on, and it was only 2 nights. And if you stayed out the second night in town, if you met a nice lady and stayed in town, then you probably would miss the trip back the next morning because of curfew. You couldn't. So in effect, you're only in town 1 night. Then you had to be off the street at a certain time. And we were aware too that there were people, we used to call them cowboys, young Vietnamese males who were prepared to, of course you were drinking and everything else you were going to do, because let's face it, you didn't know what your future holds, so that when you go on leave, you experience all there is to experience. So that means you are vulnerable then to young males who want to knock you on the head and take your money or whatever. So you still had to have your wits about yourself. So you didn't really do any silly stuff. Because, like for example, one of my mates, there was always a lot of blokes trying to sell you stuff, or beggars or whatever. And you learned that part of if a bloke had this tray full of watches, and really it's only going to cost you $5, right? Equivalent of $5. So you learned how to barter, because that was what you did. That was the enjoyment part of it. You didn't just buy that watch for $5. You learned how to engage with the local son sitting there. So you'd be looking at the watches, and you might look at the silver one over here and look at that one and show your mates, put that down, or you might ask him how much, and he'd tell you, it's $20 or whatever. No, not too much, and you look at something else and you go back to the silver watch, and how much? And $15. And in the end, it's going to be $3, so you'd buy it. But the interaction was that bartering, which we never had in Australia, was part of the deal. But one of my mates, they were selling cigars. He grabbed a cigar and ran. And of course he yells out, and their local police were called the White Mice. They had a white shirt on and they were armed, Smith & Wesson. He bullied me and shot at my mate's head. So, the White Mice, what was the joke? Bang, bang, stop or I'll shoot. Shoot first and ask questions later. As well as that, there were MPs getting around, both American and Australian. And they caught you with contraband, even soap was contraband. Knives, flick knives, anything like that. Grab you, throw in the truck. They take you back where you're staying. Like they wouldn't arrest you or anything, because what are they going to do to you? If we all got arrested and thrown in the clink, who's going to go and fight the war, So you could be a little bit outrageous, but you're mindful of the risks and what could happen to you. So you generally behaved yourself. Blokes might have got a bit drunk, but that's about it.
You mentioned that bartering system. Was there bartering for sex?
Yes. What happened, they have all these bars, you see. And they're really like the old cafes we used to have in the 60s, where they have like all the cubicles, in the bar there. And they'll be playing music. And you'll walk along, and there'll be 3 or 4 girls hanging out of the doorway. And their object was to get you in there. And you could tell the new blokes, because they'd come out and they'd grab hold of it and they'd touch on the bum or whatever. And the new blokes would be sort of jumping out of the way. The blokes would be, well, just push them out of the way. And because you've got to understand that it's an industry that if you get in there, we could buy beer back at a camp for about 20 cents a can. And we're buying Budweiser down there for $1. So that was, 5 times the price. But that's the way it is, isn't it? I mean, you go to a restaurant now and you pay $6.50 for a beer. What the girls would drink was coloured water. It might cost you $3. So all they were there to do is to just draw the money out of you. And as well as that, they were all pretty good looking, a lot of them were students, etc. And if you wanted to take the girl somewhere, you had to go up to mama's son and barter for how much, you see. But you found that they'd say, you come back later, you come back later. What they found was, what we discovered was that these were the day groups. And when you come back later, they'd gone and the night shift had come on. And they were all seasoned, I suppose. So there was this different grip of a night time. And the ones that were beautiful would cost a lot of money. Well, and the ones that weren't so beautiful, and what you had to wait, I think curfew was 10 o'clock, so you had to wait about 9:30, 9:45, because then the price was starting to drop, you see. And I think it used to cost, all night was about $18 or something. We could go with a girl all night for $18. But someone else asked me about these girls, and I said, well, they were just like you. They were just caught up in the war, and there was a bit of camaraderie, like it was a bit like a friendship, or they were just as victims of the war as what you were. So you were consoling each other, I suppose, It wouldn't be like it is today.
Was there any punishment?
Yeah. What happened they punished us once and realised it was a futile effort. What happened? Breaking curfew, that's right. And we were out at a fire support base out in the bush, and they come round to me, because I was one of the few blokes that had boot polish boots that used to keep them softer, but after a while you didn't worry, And they all come round to me because there was some like this sort of court thing. And I think they all got fined, I don't know, $5 or something. It was really a waste of time. All it did was delay us in the bush from doing what we should have done. So I don't think they ever did it again.
So were they fining all the men?
Oh yeah, you got sprung, because the people used to do silly things when they knew curfew was on and going to miss it, they tried to break into the army camp at Vung Tau. Well, that's probably not a very nice thing to do in the middle of the night with blokes sitting behind machine guns and barbed wire. So Whether it's a furphy or not, I don't know, but nothing really happened. I mean, one bloke was picked up, he'd been smoking marijuana, he had a flick knife on him, I think he had some cards, we weren't allowed to have any pornographic stuff, and I think they had decks of cards with nude pictures on them. You name it, he had it, and all they did was pick him up, dropped him at the base and told him not to be a naughty boy, and half an hour later he's back in town. I mean, what could they do to you? Unless you do something really serious and they throw you in the slammer. Otherwise, everyone would be in the slammer. So we knew we were sort of a bit protected. You knew there was a support network around. You weren't just really on your own. Like, wouldn't do any of that stuff now, but it was different, you know, the rules are different.
So how often would you get some leave?
Not very often. It was about, what would happen is that we go out in operation, generally three or 4 weeks, sometimes 6, but generally about that. We'd come back and they send us down there for 36 hours, come back and we go out again. So, because it was such a short period of time, you wanted to do a lot of things. So there was not much point sitting all day getting on the grog, so you tended to sort of not sort of do that a lot. Although you did it, but it didn't occupy all your time. You know, if you had a week there, you know, you'd be drunk for 2 days, it wouldn't matter, but because you're only there for so long. So I think I said earlier about 8 times I went to Vung Tau. Might only been 7, but it wasn't a lot. About twice in the centre of town, the rest out on the beach. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that the people who were based at Vung Tau and people who were away where you were, there were differences in the perception of the type of war you were fighting.
Yeah.
How difficult was it to sort of come into Vung Tau and then go out again into that combat situation?
Oh, well, you just accepted it. I mean, that was the funny thing about it. I mean, it was just as if the war was switched off. And I mean, we would have our weapons with us when we travelled down by truck to Vung Tau. When we get there, they'd be locked away. Then we walk around in civilian clothes for 36 hours and we grab our weapons and back out again. So you just did it. It was a nice break, so it wasn't difficult to switch back on. You just, as soon as you're out, you're back into it, you know. But the first day was the worst. First day used to kill you because that's when you're carrying the most weight and, you know, you're probably a little bit seedy, and of course they really work you the first day. You know, it's to be pouring out here. You just travel a lot of kilometres on the first day. Well, that's not true, you couldn't. But you'd spend a long time moving, so it used to knock you around the first day. Yeah. But,
what kind of reputation did the Aussies have in Vung Tau on leave, say from the Americans? Or
I don't know. I couldn't answer that. I don't think we would be dangerous, I wouldn't like to think, but I suppose didn't care. I don't know. I think we'd be a bit reckless, but fun-loving, you know. That's the way I would like to think about it, but it mightn't have been like that at all. I just don't know from our perspective. We really didn't get up any mischief, you know. Didn't wreck anything. One of the blokes came back to the R&C centre. He's a bloke that took over my job on the machine gun. Come back and he's got marks on his head and that, and he must have done the wrong thing by one of the girls, so Mama San got the broom to him. He wanted us to go back and, you know, sort him out. And I remember saying, you've got to be stupid. If you got into trouble with Mama San, that's your own stupid fault, you know. So no one went back with him, you know. So you don't want to fight women, you know. But if it had been, say, some yank belt him up, or they don't have other units in town at the same time, we would have probably done something, but not a bar or Mama San, you know, silly fault. So we must have had this code. Yeah.
what about the Yanks?
Didn't have a lot to do with the Yanks. I think they were intimidated by us. Certainly when we went to that Yank air base, they stayed right away. But they wanted to get to know us, you see. And we didn't operate, or certainly our unit didn't operate with the Yanks. We did get support from them, from helicopter gunships, from the dust-off helicopter, and also jet aircraft, Bobcat 1 and Bobcat 2, I remember. And it's great listening on the radio. I mean, they have this, we're all very disciplined on the radio. The Yanks say whatever they like, sort of thing. So for us, it was a bit of a novelty hearing them, you know. But
What would they say on the radio?
oh, just their manner. The Australians were just stuck to, it's like if you ever watch something with the British is always very disciplined, you know. And we had these, because the second 6 months of the tour I was on the radio, had the radio. And we'd come across a rather large bunker system, and one of our platoons was on the other side, and we ran down a ridge line and to support them. And the enemy were in the centre, and what they do is they bombard with artillery, and usually the shrapnel's flying past you. Then what they've got to do is bring the helicopter gunships in, so they have to cease the artillery, strafe with the gunships, and then out of the blue, here's Bobcat 1 and Bobcat 2. It was just amazing to hear these voices, you know. So, but we didn't have any really operational role with them. Probably a good thing, because they used to operate totally different to us. So they probably all thought we were mad, which we were. We were near some Yank bases in the north part of the province, up near Longcard. And often we would have their radio messages till one of us changed frequency, you know, things like that. I even heard a bloke going to a Bob Hope show on top of the Nuadin Mountains, and this bloke rings up and he's going to the Bob Hope show, and later on he calls up the radio and you can hear music in the background till his mate's at the Bob Hope show, so you can hear the music in the background. So radio is a funny thing. You can't pick up something, you know, 100 kilometres away, and then I don't know where these blokes were, just picked them up from them.
What are some of the more difficult memories you have about episodes that happened in terms of the war and the combat that you're in?
The things that happened, or the things that linger with me? What?
Well, the things that linger with you and have made the most impact.
There are only a couple, because I had two jobs. I was a machine gunner, I was number 2 machine gunner for 6 months, and then I became the radio operator. So I had two different jobs within the same group. But what I used to do, I was the first one to buy a camera, and I bought a Canon single-lens reflex EXEE camera, and I got this thing. I thought, how the hell am I going to work out how this thing works? But anyway, I had this little book with me, a little pocket book on photography, and everyone borrowed that, and I don't know where it ended up. But anyway, after our first contact, they come out in a chopper and sent down a rope, and there was a bag, and what we had to do was to photograph the enemy so they could identify. So they called me in, because they must have thought I was the guru, you see, of photography. And what it was a was a Polaroid, open out bellows type camera, and it was just a black and white film with 8 pictures. You know, we're talking about late 60s technology here. And so they said to me, okay, you've got to get a profile and a headshot. So I thought, oh, okay. And I can still recall, it's not an image that upsets me, but it's an image that somehow I don't have a reaction to it, so it doesn't upset me. But what it was, that there was a blowfly went down the throat of one of these dead blokes, and you could hear the blowfly in his throat. And that image has stuck with me for a long while. And I remember telling one of the counsellors from the Vietnam veteran, and he reckons that my photographing of the dead blokes will, I said, he said, how? I said, look, it doesn't worry me at all. It was just part of the job that I had to do. But what happened, the sights on the camera had an open square and a little small tiny one, so it was the viewfinder. I got to get a profile, so I lay down beside this bloke and I'm framed up the head and I click the thing, and then they pull a piece out and put it between a clip and put it under their arm. We wait 30 seconds and then we peel the back off, and we're all standing around. There, a perfect picture of the bloke's ear. I got too close to him. So that's an image that always comes to mind, and it's a story I can tell that has no effect on me. The sad thing about all the stuff that we did, whether someone was wounded or killed, or whether they went home early because they were national servicemen and their time was up and they had to go back, the sad thing is that when you're out in the bush, you've got to be secure all the time. So you're really in a circular pattern and looking out all the time. So when something happens, you only know what's happening in front of you, and things are happening back in there. That's the idea, you're protecting them. So when a bloke was leaving, you didn't get a chance to say goodbye or anything. They just went out in a chopper and that was it. So to me, that years later, I mentioned to someone that was the saddest thing, that these blokes just left and you never saw them again. Didn't matter whether they were wounded or killed or whatever. And to me, that's the saddest thing of the lot. There was just no consideration for, you know, I was going to say trauma, but that's not the right word. The firefight that you were in is over and you keep going because you might do the same thing again tomorrow. So it was a continual thing. So whatever happened on the way, it was like playing football. Oh, he's hurt, just bring on another bloke and away we go. Whereas they should have stopped and sort of, looking back on it now, we should have just stopped and say, okay, and do something about our losses there, you know, so that you can sort of take it in. And so I think that sort of that sort of aspect was very, very badly handled, you know. One time a couple of us got to go to the hospital, but not everyone could go and all this sort of business. You know, the whole platoon should have went down, you know. We had a couple of blokes in the hospital and we all weren't allowed down there. So to me that was unfair, that we should all went, or at least someone said, who wants to go, and those that want to go, go. But instead of saying, okay, we can take 5 blokes, so what do you do? So to me that management of the troops in doing their job was very poor. So, but then again, I suppose the background to all of this is that in previous skirmishes they could do that, pull them back and everyone take a break. Well, in our job you couldn't. We were just continually out in the jungle all the time. So I think that was a big thing why there's a lot of problems. From that stemmed all the problems, then I would suggest. Yeah.
Why do you think it was that image of the dead enemy and the blowfly that stayed with you? What was it about that lingered?
It must have been the buzz. I don't know. It was reverberating down his neck. I mean, I can still hear it. It's not. I don't regard it as a frightening image or anything. It's just an image that's there. And I suppose that's in dealing with death. I mean, you know, the insect attack is just a normal process, isn't it? You know, that happens. But I mean, we're talking, 1970, where I knew nothing. So prior to that, I hadn't seen a dead bloke. So, yeah, it's just that image that stays with me.
Do you remember the first time you saw a dead body?
Yeah, it didn't affect me at all. Certainly not the enemy. That's how well we'd been programmed. Did not feel a thing. You know, just didn't. Although when we got a couple of wounded blokes, I did feel sorry for them. And that's another inconsistency. As soon as the firefight's over, then you repair all the wounded no matter who they are. You know, we end up chopping this bloke out. I think he did die, but you held no malice or revenge or anything like that against them. It was if see, the rules of war were still there. You know, the firefight had now finished. So what we do now is mop up and look after everybody, because really that person is just a soldier like you. You know, he's wounded now. The battle's, that little skirmish has been won. Let's fix them up. You know. So so whatever happened to the enemy didn't affect me at all. So I think they talk about that. Ambulance drivers talk about the same thing, particularly if they've got kids, and there's a kid in a car accident. Then they feel the emotion. So we didn't have to deal with any of that. It was just the enemy. You know.
What about mates? What about your fellow Australians?
Well, what they did is that you didn't get to see them. If someone got hit, what you had to do was protect the area. So you all couldn't go rushing in. So you had to keep the area secure. So you had a medic that would go and fix them up. They'd organise a chopper, things like that. And you were just, you might be up. There was one time where they had to winch blokes up, and you were watching them being winched up. But that was about it. There was no, you couldn't all go in there and say, see you later, mate, you'll be right, or whatever. So that's what I'm saying. There was just total detachment where they're just gone. And even when you go back to base camp, all the gear's gone. There might be another bloke already there. So that was very, very badly handled, I think.
What impact did that have on your grief for someone who died if you didn't actually have that process of letting go, if it was just there one day and gone the next?
Well, I think that's the point. You didn't have any grief. And then it serves us 20 years later. They did have a memorial service, but to me it was pretty sort of, artificial. Sorry, am I coughing in the microphone? the grief never hit me till probably 5 years ago. So because I understood what it was, and I think my body was reacting to a lot of things, and I didn't really understand that grief or loss till I did that course. And I think that's accepting that when someone explains, it's funny how you do all this stuff and then someone points out something and you suddenly have this great light bulb goes on where you then identify it, you know, and it's very sad. And in my particular case, the biggest thing that was worrying me, and I can talk about it now, but when I first tried to talk about it, it used to really upset me. And I used to go and see a fellow from the Vietnam Veteran Counselling Service, and he was a very good operator, and a local bloke here. And I was helping him out because he does courses for vets, Vietnam veterans, and he wanted to do this one he had called Seasons for Growth, but he wanted some examples and how he might, and I think, and I said to him later, you conned me, but anyway, in a nice way. And what it was about was people telling their story, and since from that I've learned that if you tell your story, you're on the way to healing. And so I was modifying this in the language that blokes would understand, because a lot of blokes, not only Vietnam, but blokes don't like the airy fairy type language, and it was an American thing, so you imagine the language. So I gave him this story, and the story I called it Fred's story, and I was crying when I wrote it, and I couldn't read it out, I got him to read it, and of course it was my story. And I can probably talk about it now. What it was when we went to Vietnam all through our training, I was a number 2 machine gunner, and a machine gunner is a crew-served weapon. Okay, number 2 has to carry the ammo, the spare barrel, and his job also is if something happens to the machine gunner, he's got to get the machine gun working again. And you really are a packed mule. And the machine gunner, of course, when he's getting tired, doesn't want to hand the machine gun to you, because then that would be a sign of weakness, you see. So you're playing second fiddle, and all through our training we did this, you know, for 5 or 6 months, then overseas for 5 or 6 months, and I needed a change, and I changed over and became the platoon radio operator. And anyway, how that come about is our platoon radio operator was going home. He was Nasher going home early, and I said, yeah. So I was talking to the radio operator, and he said, oh, this is a good job, you know what's going on, yada yada yada, you know. I said, oh, okay, wouldn't mind doing that. Anyway, I went off to R&R and came back, and the platoon sergeant says to me, yeah, so you want to do the radio operator's job? Yeah, I said, yeah, I wouldn't mind, you know, because I was carrying a lot of stuff, now I'd carry the radio and stuff. Oh, all right, they sent me on a 3-day crash course, learning how to use radio procedure and how to send a message and all this sort of stuff, so I was it. Anyway, the reason I changed is that being with the machine gunner all the time, we were hooching up, we were there together all day, every day, and we're just like a married couple, you know, like for example, when we'd hoochie up, we'd carry the hoochie already pressed together, so he'd carry that and I'd carry something else. And because one of us had to be behind the machine gun, when we were setting up where we'd sleep for a night time when we'd harbour up, he might go and cut a bit of an area and put the tent up, and then I might go and cut a trench around in case it rained, you know, so the water wouldn't flow and we get wet and things like that. Anyway, we're always having tiffs and fights. I remember he gets up and gets the shovel. And when he digged the trench, he only did his side, so I had to get up and do my side. And it was, you know, the petty stuff you get into. But then when I became the radio operator, we sort of things changed with him, because his new bloke didn't operate the same way, you know. And I think we had a bit more of a respect for one another. Anyway, we started operating half platoon lots, because a platoon is supposed to be 30 blokes, but we had probably about 22, 23. We used to split in half. Platoon sergeant take half and platoon commander take half. Anyway, we were doing these ambushes around this rubber plantation. And this particular day I decided, or somehow I went with the platoon sergeant. And the other group actually got hit, and the machine gunner got killed, and the radio operator got badly wounded, got a leg blown off. And I can talk about this now, but really I was a kilometre and a half away with the other group when all this happened. And it wasn't until years later I got this big sense of guilt that I let, Peter was his name, Peter down, because I wasn't there when he was badly wounded. in a sense, we're talking about this grief and guilt, etc. Now, I wouldn't have been able to prevent it, but we'd been together for nearly 12 months straight in our training and on operations, and I'd left. Our friendship actually improved, and he goes and gets killed, and I'm not there with him. And that simple thing was probably the biggest thing that I was having problems with. And when I wrote this story, and I was crying writing it, I said to this bloke, I've got this story here, and I gave it to him to read, and I broke down again, and we worked through that till the end I could read my story. So this business about counselling and stuff really does work, because you're able to, it's not the fact you get upset, but you can work through things. And I've told a couple of people that, so I said, look, this is such a simple thing, but for me, that was my biggest episode of grief in the whole 12 months, you know. So I can now calmly talk about that without just a slight quiver of emotion, but that's it, because I've told the story enough now for me to know that it's not a bigger deal as what I thought it was, but it was a big obstacle for me to reveal that to somebody initially. And that same incident affects about 5 other blokes. I know the forward scout on the day, and I'm meeting him up in Brisbane in a few weeks' time. He feels that he's at fault because he should have spotted something. It's his fault that they're walking along, and that's what happened. The commander at the time, he hasn't come to grips with it either, and he's in denial, and we're trying to, I was going to say where he lives, but I won't say that. He's living outside Australia at the moment, and we wanted, well, certainly I've sent him a few emails and said, look, you've got to tell your story. You've got to tell the blokes what it was like for you. And this healing side of it needs to be worked through, and to overcome that grief and loss. So it's only the simplest things. I said to you before about one bloke who was back at our base camp at Nui Dat, and he is just very remorseful over the fact that he wasn't there. So the blokes that were there, they don't have a problem because they had to deal with, it's us that weren't there that felt the greatest loss. Now, how do you rationalise something like that? I mean, it's just amazing.
Well, you talked earlier about your training and your preparation and the emphasis on the team and,
Yep.
and the removal of the concept of an individual.
Yep.
So if one of that team is lost, then I would imagine that there is a sense of responsibility regardless of you not playing a role. So to what extent do you feel like the Army might have let you down in terms of dealing with what they've prepared you to do in your job?
Well, we just got on with the job, that's my point. It wasn't until 20 years later we're all falling over. And now we're coming back and saying, well, what could have done? To me, I'm not sure what the answer would have been, but certainly I believe, as we do with any funeral, you've got to attend, like a funeral's not there for the person you're burying, it's for everyone else, isn't it? To sort of get together and have a laugh about, oh, I remember this, it's this sort of, whatever process we go through. That never happened. To me, it may have been, it mightn't have been practical to get the blokes together somewhere back at the base camp when all they want to do is get the body back to Australia. So I don't know what the answer would have been, and certainly we couldn't have stopped the war and all sort of thought, well, what a terrible thing this is, because we just had to get on with the job. I remember hearing the helicopter. I can hear the radio. I could hear the dust-off request, not from our bloke on the ground there, but from our company headquarters. I could hear, and I heard when the choppers are in the air, they transmit over a long range, because it's line of sight. I could hear the chopper inbound, and all we can do is stay off the net because they're taking a couple of blokes out. So you stay off the radio while anything's happening. And then when that had finished, I then called up the people at company, and I said, we're anxious to know, we were aware that there was someone dead and someone wounded. So when you're not there, it is worse. It must be, it's like your mother at home not knowing what's happening is a lot worse than being there and being involved, because you're doing stuff and you know the situation and, And I still remember where the bloke come back on the radio, and they can't say names because of security. So they give the service number and then just the initial. So as soon as they start to read out 173, I knew straight away it was that machine gunner. Now 173 is a common number. Sorry, there's another 4 numbers after that. My number starts with 279, and there's lots start with 279 because 2 is New South Wales. So as soon as it was 173, I knew it was someone from Queensland because that's how the numbers are allocated. And I knew straight away. I knew that it was our mate Peter. And then I had to then pass that information on to the platoon sergeant. And it was getting towards dark, and then we went off into an ambush that night. You just had to keep working. You know, you had to put that aside, get on with the job. And I don't know how many days. One of the blokes was actually sent back, a good mate of Peter's. I think they thought he would do something silly, but I was talking to him about it a while later. But
What do you mean, do something silly? What was his behaviour like when he heard?
well, he was there, and how the situation arose is that we were very close to a village, and we had a lot of enemy activity. And what it was the enemy coming into the village, getting supplies and coming back out. Now in a rubber plantation, you can walk anywhere because there's no undergrowth. So that we were putting ambushes in everywhere around this village. Whereas in the thick jungle, there's only really tracks they can walk along. So we had got a lot of enemy contacts at night time. Now, what we used to do by day is be seen, and then at night time we would go off another kilometre over in that direction, for example, so that we didn't mind being seen, but come dark we'd then move into an ambush. What happened this particular day is the 2 blokes walked forward, had a bit of a look, and there was a couple of young blokes in the rubber plantation. Now, around villages you get old guys, you get women and children, you don't get young blokes. So they went back and they said to the boss, this looks a bit dodgy, we don't want to go that way. The boss said, no, we've got to go this way, and bang, we had a bloke wounded and a bloke killed. And this bloke they sent out, he and I and Peter and that had all been together for the whole time we'd been in the army. So I think he might have said a few words at the time, you know. And 35 years later he's still got a bit of a chip on his shoulder. But he needs to sort of let it go, you know. I mean, the boss was 23 years of age. It wasn't as if he made a stupid decision. He had to say whether we go this way or that way or that way. And he said, well, no, we'll go this way. So I don't believe it's his fault. It's just that's what happens. It's not as if he does something stupid and say, for example, if the 2 groups are coming back together, there's a certain procedure we use for marrying up. And if you don't use that procedure and someone shoots, that mistake is a lot different to saying, okay, we'll go this way, and there is a consequence of that. The blame can't be on the commander because he hasn't made a mistake. He's just made a decision. So we're working on these 2 blokes in particular who hold a very deep-seated grudge, you know.
How difficult was that war in terms of those sorts of mistakes? Well, I guess you didn't really call it a mistake, but in terms of ambushes and enemy infiltration and the nature of the landscape, how difficult was it, you know, when you're faced with the decision of, oh, I go that way or I go that way, and dealing with the consequences?
Oh, I don't think there was any consequences. That's just the way it was. That's the way I rationalised it. I mean, because the sun comes up in the morning, you can't blame the sun, you know. So I didn't have a problem with that. And most of the blokes don't, you know. So I don't know why, you know, they a lot of anger. But another group that was with us, another platoon, they've got a couple of blokes who were decorated for bravery, and they were really gung-ho. And I was talking to only one of them a couple of months ago, and they all hate the 2 blokes that were gung-ho because the consequences were they had more losses than we had, and they really don't like these blokes that now have decorations. They really, I won't say hate them, but they have a lot of anger towards what they did and the decisions they made just to be too gung-ho. You know, you've got to be very careful. You can't just chase after somebody because they'll ambush you and things like that. And that's what happened, I mean. So, to me, that's a mistake, and you bear a grudge, and some of those fellas are suffering psychologically, but we didn't have any mistakes like that. It was just a decision, you know. So.
Can I ask you if you can remember the first contact you had where there was a casualty in your platoon?
Yes, one of our platoons was in a bunker system. The caretaker got away. What they used to do was have a caretaker there who would keep them operating. That is, keep them clean. They might have a stash of food or weapons or something there. And so what they wanted was an engineer to come in. So we picked up the engineer from the chopper and we went to this platoon. And I remember the engineer was walking behind me and that were taken in. And the idea was that they were going to probably look at what needed to destroy this system. And again, we're on the outside, so I don't see what's happening in there. And me and Peter were sitting there and we heard this explosion. And I can still remember there was an explosion there and then there were some screams off to the right, like a chorus of... And it wasn't a scream like you and I scream, they were just high-pitched. It was just a different sound, you know, I hadn't heard it before. But in chorus, like... my initial reaction was that I thought some blokes were fooling around. It was just an unusual sound to make. Anyway, the end result was there was 7 wounded and 1 was killed. The bloke killed was the engineer that was behind me. And we were not in contact with the enemy at that stage. And they requested a dust-off and we got told that the dust-off was unavailable. The dust-off is the helicopter that takes the wounded. And that was run by the Americans, I remember. Then we heard that the RAF are going to send a chopper out. And when a helicopter hovers above the jungle, it's very vulnerable. So therefore, with the dust-off helicopter, which is unarmed, and got big red stripes on the side, big cross on the side, when it hovers, 2 gunships come out with it, and they protect that aircraft. We found out later that the aircraft would not come out because there was no gunship support available. And we assumed they must have been off task somewhere else. So the RAF came out, just an Iroquois helicopter, and a Sioux, that's the round bubble type helicopter you see in the movies. And I remember seeing it flying over and the bloke got a rifle out the side and they're flying around protecting the RAF. They hovered there long enough to pull 7 blokes up on a winch, which must have been, I don't know, 10 or 12 minutes, you know, because it's that old mateship thing. There's blokes in trouble, let's go and get them out. I mean, we weren't in contact. We can't believe it that we didn't know whether the enemy were close by. They probably were, and they could have attacked us when we were vulnerable, such as winching wounded out. That could have happened, but it didn't. And so we were very sour on the American gunship, the American dust-off crew, I recall. But so my first view of an Australian soldier wounded was to watch them going with Stokes litter, with the bandages and that flapping in the breeze, and you know. But again, then they were gone, and we just had to get on with the job. So we were very detached from it all. It's just something happened and they're gone. So you didn't really see what happened. You found out later. And to try and ask somebody, oh, what happened here? All you can say is, well, I was here, I heard. It's like a car accident. If you're on the corner, and most people say, I heard this noise and I turned around and I saw this car careering on its roof over there. So in effect, they don't see the whole incident. All they see is a snapshot that happened so quickly. And from that, you put the information together, so later on you know what happened. But at the time, you don't know what's going on. Don't know who's involved, how many. The information does come around later, but all you can do is do your job. You must focus on your task. I mean, what we were doing, we were guarding the track that we come in on. So we had to watch to make sure nobody was following us, because when you move through the jungle, you do leave a track. And so our job, we had to focus on our job. So you remain detached, doesn't matter what's happening back there, you do your job. So infantry blokes are the last blokes to ask, well, what happened? And they can say, geez, I don't know, mate. There's a bloody noise over there and this happened. Haven't got a clue. So we really never used to know what happened. So
how were you able to work out how how odd those screams were then when that you first heard.
Oh, well, I thought they were clowning around. I didn't know what the explosion wasn't very loud, and it was probably 30 yards from me. It was a fairly big explosion went off, but it didn't sound loud to me. And the fact that the screams were sort of in a different spot, and I thought something's happened, and someone's clowning. You know, we always have this warped sense of humour, and I thought someone was clowning, but the screams were just very unusual, high pitched, not quite like a sigh, but that type of thing. You know, it was amazing. It's only when you reflect on it, you think, you don't know it's happened like that, and you don't know, and because you're talking to your mate, oh, geez, what's happened there? And you don't find out a couple of hours later. You know, usually someone comes around and says, oh, there's a couple of blokes down, yada, yada, yada. This is what's happening, but because everyone's got a job to do, they can't go around and be briefing everyone what's happening there and then. You've got too much to do, but someone will come around and say, oh, how's so-and-so? Oh, no, don't know. And so you just accept that you'll find out later. So we were robots, weren't we? Just don't let it affect you, just keep working. Just keep working.
So by the time you get back to camp, we interviewed a veteran from Vung Tau who said he found it very difficult when they got back to camp and his roommate was dead and there were his things. How would you come back to camp and people's personal items would be there, and how quickly would they be organised and sent back?
They would, what happened to us was, because we're still out in the bush, you know, if we had been in a big contact, like something like happens at Vung Tau, then when it's over, you go back to your base camp. But we're in an operation that's going to last about 4 weeks, and having a bloke killed or a bloke wounded, they just take them out and you keep going on your operation. So it might be another 3 weeks before you're back. When you're back, there's probably another bloke there. There is nothing to suggest that the other bloke lived there. His locker's cleaned out, all his gear's gone, everything. So that's what I'm saying, they just disappeared. It's as if they were never there. It was terrible. So that's why I believe this grieving process, you know, we didn't have time. If the gear was there, we could have sat around and said, oh, well, and someone looked after his gear and you would have known like some of the things that he liked and you could have talked about it and, you know. I remember one of the blokes who was back, the bloke that was back at the base camp, he wanted to punch out one of the blokes from company headquarters because they were going through Peter's gear and he had a little transistor radio. I'll always had a little transistor radio with a little white earpiece you used to put in your ear. And he saw this bloke with it. I don't think he was pinching it, he was just showed, and he just wanted to go and punch him out, you know, because he was going through our mate's stuff. So it's probably better that we weren't there and saw that, you know. But there was 4 blokes to a tent, and usually the bloke joined us out in the bush. So I suppose if we come back and there's a bloke in Peter's spot, it'd be on, wouldn't it, you know. So I suppose they knew what they were doing to a certain extent. But no, he's gone, let's get on with it. And no discussions, no nothing. No dwelling on how sad this is, just get on with the job. So that's what we did. So I look back on it and that's probably the worst part. So you can see it's not seeing someone maimed, it's none of that. It's these little psychological things that to me are the things that run deepest, you know, have the deepest hurt.
What do you think it was like, or for the person that was filling in for the badly wounded or killed person in a platoon?
Oh, I don't think I ever thought about it. It would have been very hard for them because look, you go through a process. What happens when you first get there? You got 12 months, and you say, okay, well, if I get hurt, I get hurt. What's it matter? But once you're there, might be a month, a couple of months, you start to think, oh, well, I really can control by not making any noise, by sneaking around, by keeping quiet, by being disciplined, by we don't follow tracks, we do this and we do, so you know how to reduce all the risks. And then you get a bloke come in, well, he's like we were 3 months ago, just sort of, oh, well, and we used to sort of educate, no, you'll do this and you'll do that and you'll do this. But I really feel for those blokes now because some of us have been there 9 months and been doing this stuff for 9 months, and here they are brand new. I mean, it must have been really hard for them. So,
Do you think you were aware at the time of the difficulty of being a replacement soldier?
I wasn't, no. I didn't care.
So how would you bring that person into the group then?
Well, you did all the right things, but really, I know you're a bit standoffish. I could try and rationalise the top of my head now as to why. There was not some reticence, but you were a very tight group and you've lost a bloke. You've now got this bloke. So, okay, you bring him in, you juice him around. But there is this, you're now fragmented group, you know. But once you get out in the bush and once you start working, no problem. But it's just that initial, whatever it is, that must have been very hard for them. And certainly I didn't go out of my way to make people welcome, not like I do now with things. So I probably just wasn't aware, or what did I say? I said I didn't care. That's probably not true. I probably wasn't aware of how difficult it was. I mean, we had enough trouble worrying about the fact that they'd gone and this and that. And so we're dealing with a lot tougher issues. And it's just a new guy. Oh, okay, we're going Fred, you know. So, but you got to know them, and then they were part of the group. But we hadn't trained with them, they were just a person coming in. So it must have been hard for them.
Can you describe exactly, in as much detail as you can remember, what the nature of those operations were you were doing, from leaving camp and preparation through to completion?
Yes, I said we were continually on the go, so it was just another day. So what would happen is that our gear would be packed ready to go. We would carry something like this: 6 days food, 4 days water. And we had a certain amount of ammunition we carried. So there was a set thing that we carried. So your gear was packed ready to go. What would happen, we'd have the SAS might have been out in an area, might have found signs of something. Okay, as a result of that, the battalion commander might have decided to deploy his whole battalion, his companies, or whatever that he decides to deploy blokes out in the field. So he would have a briefing of his company commanders, and they'd divvy up areas that we'd all go to. They'd organise how we would get there by chopper or whatever. What we would find out, we weren't privy to all of that. All we have the platoon commander would get his orders and say, okay, what's happening? We're going to this area, and he might be telling us who's supporting us with that. We sort of didn't care about that. All we were interested in was where we're going and how far we're going to walk the first day. You know, you only wanted to know the nitty-gritty bits, weren't care about who's doing this and whatever. And so what would happen, they would try and drop you in when another group was coming out. That way there would be a secured area that you would land in. Sometimes they couldn't do that. So you'd be in the choppers in the air. I used to love riding in choppers. And you could see over in the distance the smoke and that, because they would be throwing artillery onto the area that we're going to land. Or what they could do is throw it onto something 500 metres away. And then before about to land, they lift the artillery back to where we are, bomb it all, and then we come and drop in. So they might have like a decoy area. So it was fairly complicated. Plus there was a chopper flying around directing the fire on the ground with the artillery. So what would happen then, you'd dive down the choppers at treetop level, maximum speed, drop in off the treetops to a clearing, and I don't know how fast you're going, but a zillion miles an hour. We're not strapped in, we're just sitting on the floor of the chopper. And they rattle and vibrate. They scream across the clearing, and to pull up, they've got to pull the nose up to drop their forward speed, and then hit the ground. As soon as they hit the ground, we just fall out, and they're just gone again. So if you can imagine a chopper coming in, down across the grass, nose up, pull up, hit, we fall out and he's gone. So he's probably on the deck 2 seconds and we're out. On the grass, while we're coming in, they have a crewman on either side of the machine gun, and they are shooting into the tree line, so that when we hit the ground, we're out into the grass, they're gone, and we have a predetermined way of where we're going to go to, because there's another chopper coming in, so you've got to get out of the way. So that's the landing. What would happen then, on the first day, we were trying to get as far away from our landing as possible. So depending on the area we've got to cover, we might have to walk to it or whatever. And that used to be the hardest part, because we had to cover a lot of distance, you're into a new area you know nothing about. Once you're there for a couple of days, you used to get a feel for the place. But you knew nothing. You might have still been suffering the effects of Vung Tau. And the first day was just a hard grind to get there. We camped that night. And how we operate in the field is that machine guns have to be manned all night. So what they do there is and because there was only 20 of us, we used to only man, say, 2 machine guns on the likely enemy approach. Okay. Now how that would work is that we would be on duty for 2 hours during the night. And while you're on that 2 hours, you come on, there was a guy there, he went off in an hour's time, so I might have been on from 10 till 12. When I got there at 10, there was a bloke there, he went off at 11 and another bloke comes on. I go off at 12 and then he goes off at 1, so that's what they call a staggered shift. So you'd average about 6 hours sleep a night. And it's worse if when you got off you only had an hour to sleep, but infantry soldiers can sleep anyway. Then we would get up next morning, have a bit of a clearing patrol out, a few blokes go out and have a bit of a geek around after dawn, and we would have breakfast, and I'd have a can of, I used to call it short soup, I don't know what it was, we used to swap a lot of stuff around, so I tended to have the same sort of pattern. A little tin of, like, I used to call it short soup, and a coffee, that'd be breakfast, and then we would get the orders as to what we're doing. Usually what happened, we went so far for a couple of hours and stopped. Half the platoon went out and had a look that direction, came back. Meanwhile, the rest of the platoon is resting. When the other mob come back, then we go out. So that way we weren't walking continually every day. So we could rest off, have a bit of a snooze in the middle of the day. From that would determine what we'd do for the rest of the day, whether we might have found water or a track or whatever. So for lunch I would have, I used to have a tin of, it was called a pecan cake roll. I would still love to have one today, I never got sick of them. And I used to carry a little bottle of, we used to call it GB juice, it was cordial, but it was concentrated. And just a bit of that, I used to like lime with water, and that was lunch. And we used to be very skinny, but made up for it since. Then about 4 o'clock we'd be looking to settle down for the night. If we'd found a stream or a track or something, then we would ambush. What would happen, we'd go into our harbour, we would get ready, we'd clear paths in the jungle that we could move silently at night time. We'd put some string up so we could find our way of night time. We would practice going to the machine gun, because when it's pitch black you can't see anything. And there used to be some silly blokes, because when you put the string around the tree, you've got to put it around a certain way so that when you come to the tree, the rope is on, or the string is on the edge of the tree. If the string went around the wrong way, you'll fall on the string and you'd run into the tree. You couldn't see a thing. So some blokes would do that. But that's why you went and had a look while it was still daylight. So then we'd settle on our routine for the night on who was on what time and who you had to go and wake up. The bosses would have a bit of a debrief on the day and work out what was happening the next day before it was dark, so that they could work out what's happening the next day. And then for tea I would have a tin of meat, which is a little bit bigger than a size of a baked bean. It had a meat sort of base to it, and also a small tin of fruit. That'd be it. The other thing we used to do is I used to swap around cocoa. We used to get cigarettes in the rations, and I used to swap around. I used to get extra bits of cocoa and things like that. In the Australian pack we used to get a chocolate bar. And I remember one day, and we used to get condensed milk and stuff like that, tea and coffee. And I'm heating up some water, and I'm making a chocolate drink up. So it's just this hard, rock hard chocolate, a bit like cooking chocolate, you know. And yet I'd bite a bit off and I'd chew it up. I was spitting it in the cup. And what I was doing was making like a chocolate drink. And I remember once this bloke came up and says, "What's that?" I said, "I'm making chocolate. You want a sip?" And of course, I've been chewing it up. Oh, bloody beautiful. I don't know who that was. I must remind someone of that. But the humour was good. Look, he used to laugh all the time. There was once when I had the radio and we were having they'd have the O group just as it's getting, before dark, sorry, because just as it's getting dark we all stand. And usually what happened is the section commander would bring a brew in and they'd sit down and have a natter over brew. Anyway, the platoon commander's there and we're sitting around and one of the section commanders there and he's taken one boot off, and taking his sock off and he's wiping out the his toes. You know, you get a bit of stuff between your toes. And while he's doing it, the platoon commander's telling a joke. And the joke the platoon commander's telling about this officer that found this little frog and put it in the cup canteen belonging to this sergeant. So as he's drinking, this little frog's floating in the drink. Well, these section commanders thought this was hilarious. They're rolling and laughing. And the platoon commander thought he was telling a great story, but the real reason they were laughing is that off to the side, this fellow who's just been wiping the stuff between his toes, the boss's brew's heating up and he's dipping his sock in his brew. I was telling the story, and they're all laughing. So the boss thought he was telling a good joke. So practical jokes. Sorry, we're talking about the sequence, weren't we?
Yeah. Oh, it's very funny. So, what was the purpose of those operations in terms of the enemy?
Oh, overall, was to deny the enemy any access into the province, because we were aggressive patrolling the jungle all the time. Now, we can't be everywhere. So we might patrol that area and we wouldn't come back there, like the Nudian Mountains. I think we went there about 6 times. And as well as too, they used to leave some bunker systems there and put some sensors in. They would pick up voices and things like that, and we might go and check those out. They also had these things that flew over and could somehow tell human, I'm not sure how they worked, a human, whether it was the urine or what, I'm not sure, but so they had, you know, electronic stuff, so we'd have to go and check it out. And what we learnt was that when we initially got there, we thought we were fairly well trained until we worked with the SAS for a week. And we realised we were a bunch of rabble barging our way through the scrub because we wanted to get from point A to point B. Whereas the SAS walked very slowly, and we ended up saying, we couldn't work like you blokes, you'd nowhere, but that's why they wouldn't even know they were there. So we really honed our skills. And after that, we got a lot of contacts because we slowed down, took our time to sneak and look, and every time we come across the enemy, they didn't even know we were there. So we become very successful at doing so. My war was all about sneaking around, hitting these blokes before they even knew we were about. So when we got dropped in somewhere by helicopter, that's why we walked so far to get away from that area. Because sounds, you know, travel a fair distance, they hear a chopper over there. So they were also moving through the scrub to different camps and things like that. So we come across a number of bunker systems. Only twice were they had people in them. Oh, they might have had a caretaker or something, or we might have got people on the way to them. That's why we could drop such low numbers, because we were only dealing with probably 3 or 4 enemy at a time. So that was my war, a very, there's probably a word for the sneaky kind of thing, not just the big battles that everyone else has. So.
How far away, in 1970, when you were trying to maintain control of that area, how far away was it from Nui Dat in Phuoc Toi?
Oh, it'd only be a few kilometres. There was a range of 4 kilometres, which is supposedly mortar range, where there was just nothing. And we operated to the north and to the west of Nui Dat. There was the Nudian Mountains and the Nui Tai Vai. I don't know how many times I went back there. And then further north in the rubber plantations, because the enemy could get in the rubber plantations and move about quite easily, because they had cover from canopy from aircraft. Also, they could move quickly at night and hit a village for rations. Or they may, you know, they might have had family living in the village, and they're out in the jungle supporting whatever group may decide to come down to. See, the Australians become so good at it that there was only a couple of, after things settled down at the start, there was only that couple of big efforts to try the Australians on, because they give up on us because they couldn't take us on. Long Tan is where, by whichever way you look at it, by whether it was luck or good fortune or good army training or whatever reason that Long Tan took, the North Vietnamese and the VC really got a hiding, and at times when they came back again, they got a hiding each time. They never had a chance to build up strength, and that's why the province probably ended up being the most safest province of the lot, because we dominated the jungle, you know? And that's been the way, the Australian way all the time, by aggressive patrolling, not just sitting in your fort, but getting out there and making sure they don't come anywhere near you. Even you could be 10 or 15 kilometres out, making sure they come nowhere near you. So it works, because they found that out in the Second World War, you know, same thing in the desert. Aggressive patrolling, deny them access. So every time they turn up, there's Australian patrol bumping them, you know. But we weren't equipped to fight, because sometimes we only had patrols where there were 7 or 8 blokes. So really, we could just hit them and, well, they used to run too, but you just hit them and take off, or because there's no way you could take on a big battle, you know, because we didn't have the numbers. So.
Ian, I'm just going to ask you about your role as a machine gunner. What was your specific role once you arrived in Vietnam?
I was a number 2 machine gunner. A machine gun is a cruise serve weapon. It's the GPM GM60. And if I was prepared, I could have told you more. But the machine gun has a lot of firepower. It will knock down branches, it will knock down trees, it will cut through stone walls. If you keep shooting a stone wall, very powerful weapon. And takes 2 people to operate. And there are 3 machine guns to a platoon. A platoon is made up of 3 sections. And the reason the section is there is because of the machine gun. So the machine gun is the firepower of the section. And all the time you've got to deploy your machine gun so that in the event of a contact, the machine gun can bring fire to bear. So whenever anything happens, you have a drill where you must get yourself into position to be able to fire on the enemy. So the machine gun, very important, do a lot of training. The role of the number 2 is to carry the spare barrel. We did for a while and then realised it was a waste of time. To carry a lot of ammo, and your primary role was that in the event of the machine gunner being able to not operate the machine gun, you had to go and get the gun working. So you were just basically a pack mule is the way I looked at it. So but I did all my 6 months training and 6 months in Vietnam as a machine gunner before I moved on to the radio.
So were you a machine gunner when you're going on these patrols?
Yes, yeah.
So how would that work when you were on patrol? What would be the role of the machine gunner and where that would be placed in the...
Okay, out of the group of 10 men, there was a certain sequence under which we patrolled. There was a group at the front called the scout group, the gun group, and then a rifle group, so 3 groups. And roughly 3 people within each of those groups. In the event, so the machine gun was actually protected in a way, because you had the scout group at front and the rifle group, because the machine gun, you didn't want to lose that. That was your firepower. In the event of a skirmish at the front, what the machine gun has to do is all the time you're reading the ground, so that should any shooting happen at front, the machine gun has got to move either left or right and move forward to bring fire to bear on the enemy to support the people up front. So generally, if you went to the right, because in the drill everyone knew, well, the machine gun is going to go to the right, so the rifle group will go to the left, for example. The only time that changed is if it was higher on the left, the machine gun will get up on the high ground so you can fire down. So part of the program, I remember reading somewhere that a lot of the problems veterans are facing wasn't so much their experiences in the war, but their training. And someone explained to me that, imagine if you're standing on the footpath and you hear this almighty noise and you look across and here's a semi-trailer on its side careering out of control sliding towards you, what would you do? Well, you'd take off. Okay, they said, well, what if we can train you so when that semi-trailer is careering out of control towards you, you don't only not run away, you run towards it. So all our drills were, when you're being shot at, you ran forward. And that's the type of programming that happened to us. And even years later when I was in the Army Reserve, as soon as that M60 opened up, just used to go. It's like an old footballer, give them the football and away they go. So you just program to go forward. So that's a big thing to overcome that fight response. So that's what we're talking about, being programmed a bit earlier. So anyone shooting up front, bang. Your one thought was, with the machine gun, is to get up there and then to bring fire to where the fire was coming from. You couldn't see what was happening, but you could hear. And the different weapons people had, you knew where people were. And the AK-47 has its own distinct sound. And our scouts carried Armalites M16, you knew the sound of those. The riflemen carried SLRs, you knew the sound of those. So you knew where everyone was by sound. Couldn't see a bloody thing.
I was going to ask that question about specifically fighting in jungle environment.
Yeah.
What kind of challenges did that present?
Well, it was quite easy in respects in that you couldn't see very far, and you were very exhausted because of the weight you were carrying and the way you had to connect, because everything wanted to drag you back, trip you over. So we used to call it ducking and weaving. In the early days, people just barred through, and you've probably seen where they got a branch and they kick them, and then the branch swings and hits the bloke. So you've all the time ducking and weaving through, and you become very tiresome. And when you then are in contact and you've got to move forward, when the sounds take over, I don't think they've really, in that movie Black Hawk Down, I think the sounds were really good there. But most movies didn't sort of get the sounds right, because what happens, it's when you're being shot at, the sound is like a cracking whip. Now it's an automatic weapon and they fire a short burst of 5 or 6 rounds. And normally we would say bang, 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 bang. What you hear is crack, 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 and then you hear thump, 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 where it come from. So when you're moving forward the machine gun, you know they're shooting it when you hear the crack, 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 but straight away you hear the thump, 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 and you know exactly where they're at. Whereas movies tend to be, you're being shot at. No, you don't know they're there till the rounds are whistling past. And, you see the movies where someone pops up, and well, that doesn't happen that way. So, and the other thing too is you don't know how close the rounds are. They feel this close to you, but it could be 10 feet above you, and it'll have the same sound, and leaves and stuff fall out of the trees, and you're trying to sort of minimise your even when you're lying on the ground, you turn your head sideways because it's a lower profile, So you don't know how close they are, but you think they're this far away. But depending on how well people are trained, because one of the hardest things in training is that when the army trains, they do target shooting, and they're shooting at a man-sized target standing up. Well, with our training it was different. As the boss on steering pointing out that when you lie down, holy weapon, your height is about that high. So on the machine gun, therefore, if you're firing and they're 25, 30 yards away and the ground slopes away, you could be firing 10 feet above them. So what we used to do was fire into the dirt just in front of us and just pick it up a little bit. So you could always see the rounds in the dirt, and that way the rounds were always at ground level. And most of the times when we were shot at, I think they were pretty high above us. So they must have had the same discipline or training,
You mentioned earlier that when you worked with the SAS, you realised how loud you'd been previously. What skills did you learn from them about how to move in the jungle environment?
I think we realised that even though we thought we were moving, it's a trade-off. If you've got to get to somewhere, then you've got to get there, because you are under constraints that over a period of time you must cover a fair bit of distance. But there is a trade-off. But you get a feel for an area. You just get this feeling, of how it is. And one of our forward scouts, Brownie, he was one of the best. When Brownie had a bee in his bonnet and got upset about something, away he'd go. And all he had to do was try and keep up. But up front it was a lot thicker, because as each person moved, we used to have secateurs to cut some of the sharp stuff away or whatever. But it's those things about ducking and weaving so that nothing pulls off you and makes a noise. So you learn all that. Where you're treading on the ground, you're not treading on sticks and things like that, because sound does carry. And the same as you don't talk, you only talk in whispers and mostly field signals, because voices really carry. If someone's yelling out, so no one could yell out. So it sometimes was a relief when there was a contact, because somebody could yell out now, like you would actually speak instead of whispering. So I think the discipline did take its toll. I think that discipline all the time, of not enough sleep, of on the go all the time, not enough food, tired, the whole, and you just keep going and going and going. And I know sometimes we might have been out for 3 or 4 weeks, and they extended it another week. Used to nearly kill us because we just couldn't keep going. You mentally are at your edge all the time, and sometimes when it was the extra week, it used to really knock us around. So, but often what they do, they'd fly out hamburgers to make us feel good, but they'd been made about 3 hours before. Or if they were really good, they'd send out some milk. Blokes used to go funny over milk. So we used to get treats often.
So how would they drop them in?
Oh, well, we would go to a clearing and they would send a chopper. But of course then, once we got a resupply, we were compromised and we had to get away from that area again, because anyone hearing choppers knows, oh, there's probably people there. So whenever we got a resupply and full of, if we needed more ammo and water or whatever we needed, then again we knew it was a hard slog because we just had to get away from where we were. So I used to hate those first day in operations or the first day after a resupply. So, but the hamburgers was 2 buns and a rissole, and they were cold, but they were better than the rations anyway. Oh, and a can of soft drink. So we lived like kings for a day.
So what did you actually carry as a machine gunner? Can you tell me what was in your pack and what you carried and what the weight was like?
Yes, the rifle I carried, the machine gunner carried the machine gun. I carried an SLR. They both have the same size round called a 7.62, except the machine gun was belts of 100. So I might carry 400 rounds of machine gun, and each belt weighs 10 pounds, I remember. So you clip them together, throw them over your shoulder, and then put the rest in your pack. And because you couldn't put too many over your shoulders, because then if something happened, you wanted to drop the pack and you had all these rounds all over the place, And plus the links used to rust a bit too, so you wanted to keep them in the gear and away from the rain. So the SLR is a very powerful weapon, but it's heavy and it's long, not ideally suited to the jungle. Unlike the weapons the Australian soldiers got now, it's a lot shorter and lighter and terrific. But we still like the SLR, punched very strong round. Then I'd have my webbing, which for me was a couple of pouches at the front, and I might carry a couple of grenades in those. You see the movies where the Yanks put the grenades here and here by the pull handle. The problem was, not the pull handle, there's a lever, safety lever that you hold. The only problem is, if the ring gets caught on something and pops out, and the grenade drops to the ground, or it happened somewhere, someone tells a story about someone hopping a truck, so grenades go in the pouches. I might carry the odd smoke grenade. Also might carry some pieces of C4 plastic explosive to use for blowing stuff up, because if we've all got some, that means we've got plenty. I would carry 7 magazines of SLR. In the magazine there's 20 rounds, so I'd have 3 in 2 pouches and then the one on the weapon. Initially we carried the spare barrel, but that was a waste of time because in a contact we really couldn't get together and change barrels. We'd be too vulnerable, so we ended up giving that the flick. And then in my pack, I always carry 4 days water, and I forget how many water bottles, but there was a lot. In my pack, the pack was divided in 2. In the top would be the food, 6 days food. They'd supply us with, I think it was 4 days American, 2 days Australian. You'd throw most of it out because you couldn't carry it all. And pick and choose what you'd take. So and in the bottom I would have my sleeping gear, which was simply like a ground sheet. And we used to call it a silk, but I think it might have been nylon. We were lucky in that it was never really cold, so you didn't have to carry a lot of sleeping gear. And also a hoochie. During the dry season you wouldn't put a hoochie up. And we did persevere with mozzie nets, because at dusk the mozzies would come, but you had this mozzie repellent, and it was good too, because if you're a bit cold you rub the mozzie repellent on whatever it was and it would warm you up and it'd make your watch go crazy. The plastic thing on your watch would just all craze.
God, what was in it?
I don't know, but it was great. You could set the light and have it like a flamethrower. It was great. Leeches used to go berserk with it. I don't know what they'd use. They'd probably clean diesel motors with it now. It was such good stuff. And the other thing, that if you're lying on your mattress cover, you would stick to it. This stuff would do something to the plastic. And we used to rub it on ourselves. No wonder we all look a wreck. We used to put it on our face. And then in the pack, you also had pouches either side. So I might have a smoke grenade in one, something else there, and I would have my toothpaste or something in the other one. So, and one of my biggest claim to fame was that I got stung by a scorpion, and because it was in my pack, I went to get my I had a little bag, and in it was a tube of toothpaste and a brush, and the smoke grenade was there. And when I put my hand in, I felt something sharp. I thought it was the edge of the pin of the smoke grenade. So then I put my hand down further, and whack, I got hit, you know, like a bee sting, but by 10 times. And then I saw this scorpion retreating into my pack. And all I could remember was a movie I saw somewhere in this bloke in India in the desert, and the scorpion crawled up his leg and he went mad with the pain or something, you know. So that's what flashed in my brain, but was really stinging a lot. But they weren't fatal. They just doped me up for a day, and that was it. Didn't even get a trip out, you know, to have a day off or anything. So, and also ants, would they build a nest in your pack overnight. Used to love looking at all the wildlife, because sometimes you'd be sitting somewhere for an hour and you'd observe animals. But I digress from the pack.
What sorts of animals were in the jungle?
The ants were the best of the lot. They used to have big termite mounds that I'd never seen before, and the other ones were spiders, and I was really scared of spiders. And my father might have said to me, "You were scared of spiders, son. What did you do?" You know, I said, "Well, after a while, Dad, you're so tired that if they crawled on you, you'd hit them, or you know, you just once you're dirty, it didn't matter." But a lot of ants, so much so that we'd have field signal for ants. We used to see ants 2 feet, whatever that is in metric, 3/4 of a yard, 2/3 of a yard. They would have a trail through the jungle, and on the outside were these big ants, about not quite an inch long, and half the length was really the head, and they were the big soldier ants on the outside. They latch onto you, and they wouldn't let go. And they never worried us, and they used to carry little bits of foliage, a little piece, you know, be carrying them through, don't know what they'd be doing, because all the nature shows on television, well, they didn't exist then, so all this is sort of new for me. And then at night time, they'd still be moving around, and when you'd be up moving around at night time going at gun pick, you'd hear these ants, and they had a shimmering noise, like a shh noise, so you'd piddle on them, you know, anyway. Ants with the smell of honey, and on their back was a like an anchor, the shape of an anchor on their back, and so there was those ones. There was also the ones that were in trees, and they used to stick the leaves together, and they were red. And when we were on top of the APCs, they had these aerials and going through rubber plantations, and they'd knock these ants flying, and they'd fall on top of us. Meanwhile, the rubber plantation has humped dirt, must be dirt, channel of water or something. So we're going over the things like this, trying to hang on with one hand and belt these ants that are really all biting you with everything. Saw a woody woodpecker, just like the cartoon character, except the tuft of stuff was yellow. We saw some monkeys, frightened the hell of us up in the trees. Snakes, a lot of snakes, and we had a field signal for snakes. Then you'd start looking to the snakes. And there was a snake, would have been about 10 or 12 feet long. And the signal come back, snakes, and then you start looking, you know. And the sunlight was coming through a clearing, and this snake was stretched lengthwise in the sun. So what would happen, as the bloke approached it, you know, point the bloke, the snake, then when you got past it, of course the head was facing back down towards you, mate, so when you got past this big snake, it had diamond-shaped pattern on its back. It was probably about that fat, I don't know what it was called. And so you've got past it, and you go trying to stir it up to attack your mates. When we're sitting once when we had to be quiet, we're sitting there for a while, and there was this noise in the bush just in front of me about 3 feet away. And I'm looking, and it's a snake, and he's crawling through the bush, and he stopped. And I'm looking at him, and he's looking at me. We looked at one another, and I suppose I'm distance I am from you, and I'm ready to take off. Next minute, just crawled away, because you were just there observing everything, you know, and spiders. Watch them there, and you might be somewhere for an hour on sentry duty, mostly listening because you can't see very far. And you used to see spiders sitting underneath a leaf, and then you'd see the web float out and used to stick somewhere, and then they'd pull it back. And that's how they get the web across to another bush. Other spiders we saw were like, well, I'd never seen a funnel web spider, and these red, we used to call them RTA bugs, we didn't know what they were. But I know since it was exactly like a funnel web spider, only not quite as big as your hand. And we used to call them front end loaders because they were just the way they walk through the bush, and they were bright orange. I remember once we had cleaning the gun, there was one there, and I remember the rod on the gun is about this long, and I remember going like that, and this thing reared up, and underneath it had this beak. It seems strange now, like this thing was a spider, and I was scared of spiders, didn't know what it was. But I remember the clanking noise with this beak, but obviously it was its fangs, that I now know, on this damn rod, so must have been very naive. What other animals? Oh, well, there used to be the ox they'd use for their rice planting, and dogs. You know, a little old dog, you know. Well, the dogs wouldn't come near you. It must have smelt differently. Dogs would come up to you and run away. I saw a mongoose, an old hunter caught this mongoose one day, come and showed us, and then about an hour later he come back with it all cooked up, just like a casserole. But I should have had some. I rue the day that I missed tasting mongoose. Animals, what else was there? I think that's enough. Oh, leeches. Some of the fattest and biggest leeches you've ever seen. Everything wasn't out to get you. That's a period of 12 months. So. But you live with them. You know, the ants would crawl over you. Frog, I ended up with a frog on my face in the middle of the night. Ugh. It was a frog. So.
When you're in the jungle, what's the sounds that you're listening to? Especially at night when you're on watch.
You're listening for the artificial sounds. But realistically, in the jungle, you can't move at night. If you do, you make so much noise. The SAS can do it, but they might take an hour to cover 100 metres, you know, but you just move so slowly. So it was if we were near a track. All what you hear initially is you got a boot, and how you kick a boot against a rock. Well, that's usually the first noise you pick up. It's a noise a boot makes, that dull thud. And we once had some state-of-the-art electronic stuff to help us with our ambushes. And we had these 4 sensors. You put 2 up that way and 2 down this way, and you had this little earphone piece. And each of the sensors made a distinct noise. And you might hear number 1 go off, and then if you hear number 2 go off, you know something's coming from that way. But you're sitting there, and any artillery going off in the distance, the wind comes up and the branches move, these things are going off, and all they did was, so we only used them for a couple of nights and we threw them away. Same with the starlight scope. You see them now, they've got this tiny little starlight scope. We had this big one about this long, and it was great. You could see probably about up to 100 metres away. It was like a limey green colour with a slight bit of snow in it, but you could see. And we were on in an ambush in the rubber plantation, and we used to have about 4 blokes down in a triangle formation, so that whatever way they come from, we'd claymores out, etc. And there was this little bit of dirt mound. There's 4 of them there, and I'm actually the 5th person on the left. I'm what you used to try and do is get in the centre, but and we used to always have someone awake amongst the 4 or 5, so they'd gone for an hour, and then I'd go down the line, just wake each other up, and you'd be awake. You wouldn't get much sleep. Anyway, they had a machine gun on the mound, and the blokes looking through the starlight scope. The damn thing used to have this high-pitched whine. That's why we didn't like it. Don't know how far that sound travelled. And I remember the body language on the bloke with the starlight scope. He's really looking at something, and I'm laying here, and I'm thinking, I'm right on the edge here. I'm sort of on the open. And anyway, I'm straining, and he's saying something, and I'm thinking he's saying, yes, yes. He's whispering something. And anyway, then through the gloom, you learn how to see in the dark. If you look at something that sort of disappears, so if you move your eyes around, your peripheral vision picks it up. So you pick up this movement, there's 2 things moving out there. Next minute, they're coming right toward us, and I'm thinking, why doesn't he let the claymores go? We had these, their claymores of mine that has all these ball bearings, and they just get blast in the front of you. Why doesn't he blow the claymore? So at this stage now, the radio was about that high. Well, I'm down behind the radio for protection, waiting for this thing to go off, till suddenly I got closer and closer, and I realised they were 2 pigs well, I got my hat and I started bashing all these other blokes because the bloke with the starlight scope was saying, pig, pig, and I think he's saying, yes, yes, you know, so I bashed them all over there with it. So yeah, we saw some pigs. What else did we see? Oh, that's enough.
You mentioned hand signals. Could you tell me some examples of what hand signals you had to communicate in the jungle?
Yes, when you refer to people by their rank, so platoon commander or platoon commander, two things, you know, or platoon sergeant or whatever. So we developed a lot of our own. Like say, for example, if we're going to stop and the platoon commander was going to have a recce, then the symbol for a recce was to put a thing over your eye. So what would come down would be platoon commander recce. Now after a while, as you know this, you're pulling up, they go, we would shorten a lot of things, you know, because you knew what was happening anyway. If we're going to pull up, someone's having to look at something. But then we developed our own, like platoon commander's a wanker, or things like that, where you're having a joke all the time. The signals were, we used to develop our own, but you had to have a common thing, otherwise new people didn't have a clue. So you couldn't really develop, like I said, about ants, snakes, and also a change of direction was also very important. We would definitely, if we're going to change directions, the blokes are supposed to be there, and if some see out here, the best one was the harbour for night time, so we're going to stop. But they're all common sense type things, you know, not overly done like you see in the movies, just common sense. You just flap your arms around, everyone knew what was going on.
At what stage did you move off becoming a machine gunner and you went on to do another role? When was that?
About October, we went over there in, I think, May or June. So it was after about 6 months I went off R&R and come back. And they sent me on a 3-day crash course for the radio, and I was it. And two things stick in my brain. I remember years ago, I remember when we were going through our training at Townsville, we got shown these tracker teams, and I went up to one of the blokes and I said, oh, how do you get in the tracker team? And he said to me, you're a regular Nasho. I said, I'm a Nasho. He said, no, sorry, mate. And I would have liked to have been in the tracker teams. But because I was a Nasho, he said, oh, it takes so long to train you and then you're gone. And later on we get overseas and we're working with the tracker dogs for a week, and I say this bloke started talking, he was Nasho. So someone conned me there. But I really would have liked to have been with the tracker teams, but I digress. So here I am on the radio, and a coded message comes through. They send coded message in what they call trigrams. Whereas normally you spoke generally about things. You know, you might say, okay, I need you to go down to the blue line, which wherever we were, that meant the river. Or so usually you spoke in general terms without being specific about anything. But this was the first coded message I got, whereas we used to send our location every hour, and that was done in a certain, by this code wheel, and that was quite easy. Got all these trigrams, I'm writing them all down, I had no idea how to decode it. So can you believe that? Here I am, a radio operator in a war zone and can't use the codes. Isn't that amazing? So anyway, I was quickly shown that, and it wasn't difficult. The hardest part was working out which set of codes to use, because they changed every 24 hours at midnight Greenwich Mean Time. So to work out how many hours, you know, it was a bit sort of. But often if you couldn't understand the message, then obviously you look at the wrong codes and you look at the next day, for example. So you generally worked it out. And another time we had to send our location back to company headquarters every hour. And so when we pull up and resting, I'll be there throwing arrows in trees, trying to get them up. Anyway, we hadn't been in touch with anyone all day. So if anything happened to us, we were on our own. We had no comms with anybody. So in the distance I heard this chopper and recognised that it was the CO's, Lieutenant Colonel. He's the bloke that runs the battalion. He was flying around doing something, probably doing a recce, or he could have been doing anything, I don't know. So I pulled my codes out, see what their frequency is, flicked over his frequency, I called him up. And he told me to wait out. And anyway, about 10 minutes later he calls me back. And I'm not even supposed to be on this frequency, right? And I said to him, oh, I told my call sign 1, 2. I said, we're having problems with communication, call sign 1, which is company headquarters. I said, could you relay our lock stat? There was a big long pause, and he comes back on and he says, send over. So I got a sending code, and you send a certain way, and he reads it back. The thing that impressed me was he did it exactly right. So here's the battalion commander doing proper radio procedure, just like you're taught, everyone's taught the same. And then I hear him for the next 10 minutes trying to get to company headquarters on the radio to send them their lock stack. Well, this went round the battalion like wildfire. This platoon SIGers rang up the boss just to give him a location. But we hadn't spoken to anyone for about 6 or 7 hours. So I mentioned it to him years later when I ran into him somewhere, and I told him the story, and he said, "Oh, yeah, I remember that, but he might have been just being polite." But I think I did the right thing. But if I was a properly trained Sikh, I probably wouldn't have done it, you know. So you just fly by the skinnier pants, skinnier teeth. So, but it's good being the radar operator because you know what's going on. You hear everything that's coming in and everything that's going out. And you learn how to impress other people because you're always breathing heavily because you're carrying the gear and that. So that if you've got to talk while you're on the move, what I used to do was hold my breath. And because I've got a light voice, I used to talk, we'll talk deeply. And you talk very quickly as well. And often it's like the radios in the taxis. I don't mean to hear, but they're talking gibberish, but somehow they can understand it all. We were pretty quick on the radio as well because you got on and got off. But you knew what was happening, and I used to try and give a running commentary of the battle because the boss would be busy, so I'd be trying to give a running commentary on the battle, you know. And one particular day, the platoon sergeant was panicking a little bit, and we had the gunships firing rockets down at us, and they get a shh, boom noise. You can hear the rocket and then the explosion. Anyway, the sergeant, mortars. They're thinking the enemy's got mortars. And I said, no, they're rockets from the gunships. And he said, ring him up to see if they're firing rockets. And I thought, well, I've got to do as I'm told. I felt like saying, you know. So here I am, and it's a fairly big battle going on. So I take this deep breath and the deepest voice I got, and I still remember it was Bush Ranger 7-1. That was his call sign, and I think it was 1-2. We were working with another unit, and I still think I had the same call sign. So it's when it's always Bush Ranger 7-1, did I say? There was 7-1 and 17. Bush Ranger 7-1, this is 1-2 over. Heard nothing for a while. Bush Ranger 7-1, this is 1-2 over. And this bloke comes back on when the chopper pilots come on in the background, you hear noise. And it's like these blokes are in an armchair. You know, they're so calm and collected. It was great talking to them. And I remember him saying, oh, 1-2, this is 7, questioning Tony's voice, but also their throats go because the chopper's jerking, so you hear something, oh, 1-2, this is 7-1 over. And I said, oh, can you confirm you're firing rockets? Oh, yes, that's right over. You know, and I thought, oh, this bloke's in a deck chair up there or something with the sunglasses on. Anyway, a couple of weeks later, we went down to 9 Squadron down in Vung Tau. We had a barbecue with them because they did some good stuff for us. And I saw this bloke talking to this guy, and they're talking, and I said, oh, excuse me. I said, were you Bush Ranger 7-1? And he said, yes. And he was a typical RAF bloke with a big nose and moustache, you know. So I said, oh, it was call sign 1-2, you know. Oh, 1-2, oh, yeah, I remember the squeaky little voice calling up the radio. Thanks very much. But the radio's good because you know what's going on. And everyone looks after you because if you're in trouble, we need the radio. So when you're coming somewhere and you're carrying a bit of weight and you've got to walk across the flimsy, there's always something to help you along because they don't want you to lose the radio. So it's a good job, radio operator.
So what's the gear? Tell me about the radio that you were carrying.
It's called a 25 set. It's one of those rare breeds that is soldier proof. The thing just keeps working, and I think they're still using them, and they're old when we had them. And they are just a rugged piece of equipment. So I used to have a frame. I didn't have a pack, I had a frame, and attached to that I had it's called an A-frame. And I had a pack inside that. I had my bedroll and food all in one. At the top of I had the radio, which is about, I don't know, 2 foot across by 1 foot down, about that thick. Plus I had to carry a couple of spare batteries, big heavy batteries. And I used to carry, we used to have a little battle whip aerial, and I used to carry a 10-foot aerial, and also another aerial that you could throw up in the tree when you wanted better comms at night time. Excuse me, things like that. So all up, I was probably carrying the same amount of weight as the being a number 2 machine gunner. But I had a different weapon. I was given an automatic, an Armalite, which is a lot lighter. And what that meant was I didn't need the webbing because rather than have the webbing with the big magazines from the SLR, on the M16 there's smaller magazines. And they used to issue rounds in what they call a bandolier, clips, and they used to fit into a little bandolier. And they nicely held an M16 magazine. So this bandolier you put over your shoulder and you had all your magazines in the bandolier, so it was a lot easier. So when we were stopped and I go out with half the platoon and come back, what they'd do, a bloke would come over and he would give me his rifle, a couple of magazines, and take my bandolier, weapon and one water bottle, and away they go. So that's the way we could sneak around a lot, because doing a short patrol each time with hardly any gear, you could really get around. So we sort of worked pretty smart after a while. And, but the radio, yeah, was a good job.
So what information were you communicating, and where were you communicating between?
Every hour had to give our location. Our area of operations would have already been pre-known, but each day we would, as a platoon, organise our own patrols, etc., etc. But we had to give back our location, number one, for the company commander to coordinate everything, of course, because he's got 3 platoons to worry about, all running around. We also had with us by radio the artillery guys. They used radios on different frequency to communicate to the guns that were always in support of us. It was the guns, the artillery guns, that were the big thing that the Australians used all the time to very, very good effect. And they would use them to plot what would happen at night time. The boss would work out the route the next day. And depending on the features on the ground, a lot of time it was flat and thick and you couldn't see anything. And the theory behind the guns was that that night he would plot points for the guns to train the guns on. They might be 5 or 6 kilometres away. And by their system of plotting, they had it all worked out so they could land them at a certain point. So if we had a patrol route, we were going past a little hill, we would obviously check that hill out, but what the artillery bloke would mark that as give it a code name, so that should anything happen, he'll say fire and he'll give the code, and they know straight away. And sometimes with something happened on the ground, they could get rounds in the air in 30 seconds. So the artillery blokes are really good. So they used it as well. But for us, it was mainly our location, and the boss would often give a report over the radio. I was carrying the radio for him, so it was his radio. So all the time I used to walk on behind the boss, and he'd often say to me, listen, put that aerial away. So the aerial was whip aerial, and he used to say, he used to say to me, you're a target with a radio, I said, no, they're not interested in the bloke with the radio, they're interested in the bloke in front of the radio, so we had this banter. We would also have to put in demands for extra ammo, or for, if a bloke tore some of his gear and we needed some gear, so they're maintenance things you do of a night time. We would use them to marry up with a half patrol that would go out. We used to carry spare radio, and we have marry-up procedure when they tell us they were coming back. I used to go around and tell everybody that they're coming, because marry-up procedures can be dangerous, because all you can see is a shadow, and they're sweaty, they're no longer green, they're black, and so you've got to be careful. And then our mob were good because there wasn't a lot of code. There was no bullshit. It was just on the radio for something important and straight back off. Whereas in peacetime they tend to got the radio, want to use it. It's like a toy. They had all different sorts of systems that I didn't know or understand. But the little old 25 said, yeah, it'd keep going. It'd probably work underwater.
How difficult was it to get reception in the jungle?
Oh, very difficult. I mean, every time that we stopped, I'd be trying to throw an aerial up into a tree. I used to throw a string up and then pull it up to try and get comms a lot of times. It had a 10-foot aerial that was quite good, or whenever I stopped, I'd put the 10-foot aerial on and it folded up. But you couldn't walk along with that aerial because going through the jungle, in peacetime they used it a lot because they're in the open and they've got this big aerial swinging up. But that's why they set up, in part of the setup process of setting up a fire support base where the guns are, then they would also set up communications there. And then out where we were, our company headquarters would set up a communication area where they'd throw aerials up in the trees so they could hear us with their big aerials. So we were right on the little battle whip aerial or whatever. But it was line of sight, so as soon as you dropped into creeks or ravines, you usually lost comms. But the technology at the time, it was all right.
Ian, I just wanted to ask you some questions about the enemy and what sort of state they were in terms of equipment and progress during the time you were in Vietnam.
The first thing that struck me about the enemy was how small they were and how young they were, but I guess we were young as well, but they had a real boyish figure. And there were different types of enemy. So there was the local VC and the North Vietnamese army, and I never saw a North Vietnamese soldier up close, so I think we were lucky. We were dealing mainly with local force VC, and I don't believe they were as well trained, because the way often when they were shooting at us it was going way over our heads and it was ineffective and things like that. We often came across a lot of couriers. In the 12 months I think we had one officer, he was an officer that surrendered to us, and then all the time they were all couriers except one was an important person because he had documents and a pistol and stuff. But mainly they were courier type groups that we were intersecting, except when you'd come across a bunker system you didn't know whether they were caretakers or whatever. And we also came across a hospital system. But the thing that you think about is that they're very small, and certainly one fella that we found the next day that was badly wounded, I recall looking into his eyes, and he was frightened, but what struck me was how white the whites of his eyes were. Now I don't know whether that was because of loss of blood, but the whites of his eyes were clear, not bloodshot or, you know, like just so white. So, but they were very resourceful. They could make do with a lot of stuff. They would improvise, and that was their strength. In digging tunnels, I never went down a tunnel. The closest I got was to just look down the entrance at one. There's no way of getting me down there. The thing that struck me was how straight the edges of the tunnel were. They were perfect, you know. They were very resourceful. They could live everywhere. We had an interpreter with us for a while, and often we would be getting muddy, and I noticed what he would do was, of an evening, be a puddle of water, he would wash the mud off. And some of us started to do that ourselves, you know, to wash the mud off, so next day you only had the stain there, not the dried old mud. And so we learned from them how to live in the bush. Sometimes when we were at fire sport bases, we built structures similar to what they did. We learned how to build little tables and chairs with all the stuff. And so if you want to classify the VC, they were very resourceful. I think we did have them on the run. They were very young, and probably not as well trained as we were.
What would they generally be wearing? What would be on them physically?
They would be wearing, we used to call them black pyjamas. They would just wear the normal dress that they would be carrying satchels. They usually carried an AK-47, and their ammunition. The thing that struck me, our ammo was always new, because in operation the links used to get rusty, and so we would try and use up and always getting new ammo when it's nice and shiny brass. The thing that struck me was their ammunition was dull. It was clean but a dull colour, so it must have been a lot older. They would be sweaty just like us, which surprised me because we're all big and, you know, they used to be very sweaty. They would often carry a lot of herbs and stuff, whether it's for their cooking, I didn't know what it was. Some of them it might have been opium, I don't know, because but certainly they had some substances, and we used to burn a lot of their gear after the contact. And I remember one particular day, because it was a wet season, my sleeping gear was wet, so whenever we stopped you'd pull your gear out and hang it on a tree or whatever, try and dry out. And the platoon sergeant was burning some gear, and there was this sweet burning smell. I still don't know what it was. It could have been incense for all I know, but I know all my gear was covered in all I could smell. There was this. So as a result of that, I really can't stand those sticks people light, you know. I still don't like the smell of that.
How did the instructions work in terms of, if you came across them, in terms of ambush, kill, capture? How did that work?
Oh, you'd be told, and we would know what area we were in. Normally, we were in an area where everyone was an enemy. When you were close to a village, then the rules changed. So during the day, you assumed that they were then, well, I was going to say civilians, you assumed that they were friendly. So therefore you couldn't do anything. And often we would be near a village and be seen, and then as nightfall fell, we would take off way around the other side and do an ambush. So then once nightfall fell, any movement around the village in or out would be classed as hostile. So we would just engage them. And I remember once we were on the tidal flats, the mangroves, and there was a village further up about 200 yards away, and it was wet season, so we used to get electrical storm, and it was right out of the movies where me and my mate, the machine gunner, lying there, and every time the lightning flashed, we could see up this inlet. And then one time when the lightning flashed, we could see someone coming, because they used to wear these the friendlies wear the coolie hat that they used to wear, dark clothing, but the hat was just lighting up, and we could see there was a boat coming. I think if that was later this was very early in our tour, we were very inexperienced. I think if it was later in the tour, we just would have engaged them, without any questions, because it was about 9 o'clock at night. And but because we were new and a bit cautious about what we should be doing, what it actually, as the tide had gone out, this bloke had got caught, and what he was doing was coming back to the village, and he was pushing his canoe through the mud, and he was an old guy, he must have been about 70. So we didn't engage him, we just watched him come in. I think then if there had been a second one, we might have engaged them, but we're just being cautious, because it was just some bloke pushing a boat, and the only time we could see him was every time the lightning flashed. So it's just like in the movies, really scary. And so by now our section commander was over, and we then shone some torches on him, and I still remember covering this bloke, and I had my rifle trained on him, and I would have had no hesitation, as I remember that, because I was covering the section commander, and I would have had no hesitation in pulling the trigger. But he was an old bloke, and you mentioned that they've got to have their ID, and he must have had his ID card into 15 plastic bags, and he's opening plastic bags and getting it out. And then some people were coming down from the village, so we had to grab them and keep them quiet, but they were obviously his family who were worried about him. So because we were cautious, he was just a local village bloke that got caught in the tide. And so that was okay, everyone, we did the right thing, but I think as our tour progressed and we were aware of the dangers and the things that had happened to us, I don't think we would have been as careful.
So given the VC infiltration of local villages, how common was it for villagers to be killed or ambushed, given that suspicion?
Well, that's why you had to be careful. And the way we operated is that during the daylight hours we didn't worry, but nighttime hours, anyone moving around, they were classed as enemy. Every time we engaged, and sometimes we engaged people and they got away, and I would assume that they were in, but all the people that we had contact with were armed. So there was another group that the story goes they were woodcutters, but they were in an area they shouldn't have been in, and whether they made some hostile, but apparently they were not armed, so that happened to one of our other groups. But see, we were cautious also. We captured this high-ranking officer. Well, he surrendered to us, and again, if that had been later, was he in uniform? He might have been in uniform, and I don't think as soon as you'd seen him, he would have been gone. But it was just how, we talk about people being, when they're captured, being tortured, etc. And that's really unfair play. I think any soldier would say that. Once the firefight's over, it's over. But people got to remember that in the firefight, a soldier has the power of life or death over somebody. And later on, if they're worried about what I regard a minor thing happening, it's okay to kill them, but not okay to humiliate them, you know. That I don't sort of rest easily with that. But that officer we got, he had maps and everything.
Can you walk me through how you came across him and how you captured him and where that was?
Well, we were, it was early in the tour and we were moving near a fire trail. Now, scattered throughout the jungle there was these old fire trails. It was just a long track, if you like, that had been cleared at some stage. And often you'd get on these and you could really travel a long distance. The disadvantage was you might get ambushed. But often if we had to go somewhere in a hurry and you found one of these fire trails, away you went. And we were on one of these fire trails and he yelled out. Now I wasn't up the front, so I know the story, and I really didn't see anything because, you know, it might have been 50 or 80 yards up ahead. But he actually yelled out. And then all the blokes went to ground and he was yelling out. And because he was yelling out, then no one really shot at him. And again, if that was late in the tour, I think, because we were instantly able to become aggressive. So if something out of the ordinary happened, there was none of our blokes around because we each had an area to ourselves. So anything out of the ordinary, we just were very aggressive in our response. So I don't think he would have survived us later on when we become very good, you know, professional through the way we used to operate with the SAS and that we mentioned.
And so what would happen to that prisoner once he was captured?
Oh, I got no idea. He would go out in a chopper. No doubt they'd try and get... See, the intelligence people knew what was happening because with any enemy that we captured or killed, we had to identify them, had to take pictures of them, etc., the dead ones, so that everyone would be identified. And later on we would get a news thing come around saying, and they would say who they were and their names, and it really didn't mean anything to us. You know, they would mention that they were the D445 regiment or something. Well, to us, they were just the enemy. So,
well, because you talked about the dust off for evacuating casualties, was there a particular process for getting prisoners out?
Yes, depending on where we were. One in particular, this guy with the whites in his eyes, he got winched out in a helicopter. I think it was just a RAF chopper. I don't think they brought the dust off chopper out. I think it was just an Iroquois helicopter came out and they winched him up. But he would have been really frightened. I remember our medic impressed me because Doc was just very matter of fact, looking after him. Someone give him a cigarette, just like you see in the movies, you know. And it was amazing, like they were shooting at us. Well, that was the day before, and he did the right thing. What he did, he got wounded. And they went back down the hill, because we followed up the blood trail. Then he skirted, it actually came up right near us that night. And they do that because of the fear of getting bombarded with artillery, because as soon as we're in contact, we bring the artillery in. So that's why he's come back. And it was near dark, so we followed the blood trail so far and then pulled back. And then the next day we went and found him. So yes, I got to see him. Yeah. A bit later they did die.
Yeah. So how would it work with the interpreter? What and how were they used?
We didn't. We tried a few things. When we first went there, we had actually a VC with us, and the bloke we had was Nigel, and he used to come along with us. And because we were inexperienced, and usually whenever there was enemy camps or bunkers, etc., up ahead, there would be a sign. You know, a sign would be anything out of the ordinary. It could be a blaze on a tree, some rocks on the side of and so we would prop when someone would see a mine sign, and then they call Nigel up.
Oh, sorry, we've got to...
There's a VC who came over to our side, and they used to live in Nui Dat with us, and whenever we saw a sign or whatever, something unusual like a blaze in a tree or a branch that was broken or whatever the local group might have had to warn of a mine or something ahead. So we would be very suspicious of anything unnatural, and we called Nigel up. And you're all a bunch of pansies, keep moving. And it wasn't until Nigel used to eat very well, and one particular day he used to sleep in a hammock, and we come down out of the Nui Dins down into a more of an open grassland area, and Nigel's bashing on this tree. And you know when you bash on a tree how the sound carries. And that night we had an RPG, rocket propelled grenade round came in and exploded near us. And I don't know if that was the reason why Nigel wasn't with us anymore, but we did away with the initial interpreters. At other times we had interpreters with us, but generally we didn't. You could get the message across through through motioning, and so we didn't use them a lot at our level in the bush. So
How would the enemy ambush?
they would ambush by usually a command detonated mine. They wouldn't line up soldiers like we used to firing weapons. They would ambush by command detonated mine. That is, all you need is a slight electrical current and a fuse and explosive, and they were very good at improvising such things, or a trip wire or a pressure switch, anything that can link the current. Say for example, they would have maybe an unexploded bomb, or they might use a claymore mine that was left behind by somebody, or there were mines that were lifted out of a big mine area that they had in Fox Creek Province, and all they needed for a pressure switch was what they used to use as a battery, an explosive, and they'd use a piece of bamboo, and they'd slit the bamboo, and all they'd do is they'd drive a nail through it and then have a metal contact underneath. They buried that under the ground, and as soon as you stepped on the bamboo, the weight of the bamboo bent and the nail come into contact with the metal, and easy as that, and that could be there for so long as the batteries last. So it could have been, because the batteries wouldn't be being used, so it could be sitting there a couple of months. But what they would do is put some sort of sign that it was there. So it could have been a broken twig, a blaze on a tree, or whatever. So when you say that they ambush, they really just tried to get us at that. We had one of our other groups were chasing up the enemy, and they came across a claymore that was sat in the ground. A claymore is about that big, 700 ball bearings. So I forget how much explosive there, but will definitely kill someone and blow people to bits. And there was one set up, but either it didn't work or they didn't have time to do it. But that certainly stopped them in their tracks when they realised, So that's how they retaliated. You had to be very careful.
Did they booby trap their bunkers?
Oh yes, that's right. All our blokes weren't all killed by mines. Very rarely shot. One of the engineers got shot, but most of them were through some sort of either command detonated or not necessarily a tripwire, because they often go back and they try to reconstruct what happened. So often too they could be command detonated and the bloke takes off, in the confusion afterwards. So
what sort of intelligence did you receive about their mine technology or how they were trying to trap or ambush people? Was there some sort of dedicated person or group?
There was all this gruesome stuff that we were very well versed in what they had, and they even had an engineer's hut in Nui Dat full of all examples of how they improvised with any kind of thing. In the early days it was things falling out of trees with spikes on them. It was a pit that you'd walk over and your foot would go down. And often with a lot of booby traps, they're not designed to kill you, because if someone is injured, then what happens, because there might be say 23 of us, okay? So someone gets injured, not badly hurt, but you've got to stop, you've got to find an area where you can get a chopper in to get them out. You've got to take 4 blokes to carry them across. And what they can do, of course, is they can leave that pit there on that track forever till someone steps in it. They don't have to be there. And they had these sharp spikes that they used to put their excrement on it to make the wounds bad and all that sort of stuff. But I never come across any of those. We think all our mine incidents were claymore mines. That's what we think,
So what did this hut look like at Nui Dat?
Oh, it had a lot of drawings of enemy mines, some improvised mines, and showed you how ingenious they were at constructing something to cause maim and destruction. You know, they were very, very resourceful. But all it takes is electrical current and a detonator, and you can rig that way up any way you like, you know. And very hard to detect, you know, if you're buried under the ground, like a piece of bamboo buried under the ground with leaves over it, and the explosive could be sitting off to the right somewhere or to the left. And another thing they can do is they can, for example, the Australians never used to walk on tracks, they used to walk on the edge of the track. So then they were putting them on the edges of tracks. And what they can do is leave, let's say, an artillery shell that hasn't exploded. They can leave that sitting semi-obscured on the side of the track. And someone will come along and think, that's a mine, you know. So what probably we would have done in the early days is got an engineer out and blew it up. Or what you can do is put a grappling hook on it and pull it, let's say. But to do that, you might have to go and get behind that log or that boulder or whatever there. And of course, when you go around there, there's another mine over there. So they become very ingenious at doing stuff. So after a while, you never went anywhere near anything that didn't look right. You just stayed right away from it. So in the end, we just avoided all that sort of stuff, rather than in the early days, we tended to sort of destroy everything. No, okay, that's dangerous there. Well, then we used to leave it there after all. We just go back out of the way and come around somewhere else, because all that did was just to lay us down when we couldn't get on doing the job. So
if there was a contact, rather not a contact, but if someone was injured via an ambush or a mine, how can you explain how the investigation and the reconstruction would work, and who would talk to you?
No, I don't have a lot of information. In one in particular, it was a matter of two blokes went down. It was a matter of then securing ourselves on the ground. And at the time, we didn't know whether it was command detonator, that is, there's somebody still around, so you've got to be very careful because they've now got you at a disadvantage, or it could have been a number of things. So you could have more things in front of you, like a minefield. So I had to get the bayonets out and start to make sure that you had a safe spot. So you had to secure all the area before you can get to the bloke. There's no good running up and grabbing a bloke and you going up as well. So all those things have got to happen. And on that one incident, I really don't know whether they investigated whether or not or how it happened. So I think we only surmised that it might have been command detonator because there was these couple of young blokes seen an hour or so before. So we don't know whether they planted something, whether they were there to make us go that way, or, you know, it's just conjecture. So because it's so easy just to plant a explosive device and bury it in the ground covered with leaves that nobody knows. So there wasn't an investigation as such, if you know what I mean. So.
What were their couriers like?
They were dressed in either green or black, usually carrying stuff. It could be, sometimes they were even cooking utensils. They could be carrying satchels. In the early days, I wouldn't be privy to that because I wouldn't get to see them because I was out with a machine gun. But later on, when I had the radio, I could go and have a bit of a sticky beak. But I didn't see firsthand a lot of the things because the way we operate, we're out in the perimeter protecting ourselves, and platoon headquarters would look after all that sort of stuff. So we did get maps and things like that off some people. So, but the one particular day we were up in the Nuadin Mountains working with SAS. And this really brought home to us how good they were. And we'd been trudging around there for a few days, and there's tracks there, so you've got to be very careful. There was a couple of bunkers that they had some sensors in, and they'd heard voices. And later on they were saying, and it's obviously that the sensors had been moved because where we said they were, and they could hear kids and women laughing or something, so there was some problem there. But while we were there with this track and a couple of bunkers, we hadn't seen anything. And then a couple of blokes went with an SAS patrol, and they moved very slowly, you know, they had to cover any ground. Then they decided to prop for a rest, and one of the blokes sitting there, and he heard a noise. I said earlier about a boot kicking a stone. That type of dull thud really gives you away. And it's like if you're in the Australian bush, you often can hear a kangaroo hop. You mightn't see it, but you You can hear the noise. It's that same dull thud. And one of the SAS blokes was sitting on a rock so he could look down on the track. And he heard them coming and he realised he couldn't move then because he'd be seen. And he had an SLR that was a shortened barrel, and also the innards of it works that was on automatic. And the safety catch that you put on with your right thumb can sit in a number of positions, off, single shot, automatic. And what this bloke used to do, he used to have it sitting between single and automatic. And that way he couldn't pull the trigger, and also when he pressed it, he only had to press it so far. So that's how sort of experienced you become. You don't have it on the single, you have it in between, so it's just a tiny little movement. He had the weapon on his lap, and he saw the bloke coming up the track. Now, they wore slightly different camouflage to us, and they even wore gloves. We used to wear stuff on our face to break up the outline. Excuse me. And so the bloke's there, he's flicked the safety onto automatic, and that little click that you wouldn't hear, the bloke stopped. And prior to that, he was carrying a pack, and when you go uphill, you got to bend over with the weight. And when he was stopped and looking, he couldn't see this soldier, but he heard the click, and he stood there. So the soldier had to work out, well, what does he do now? So he let fire from shooting from the without raising the weapon. And so the fact that they were so quiet, we knew that the enemy were in the area, and that's how we realised that, gee, we're probably making too much noise and going too fast because we had tracks to walk on. So after that, we really become quite successful because we slowed down and got very smart at what we did. So that fellow, there was a couple of them. The others got away. That fellow, actually, in the pack was some cooking utensils. So whether there was someone else with them and what they were carrying, I don't know. So there was a reasonable amount of movement around the province.
What sort of facilities did they have for their wounded?
We often came across some caches, but it depends on where you were. There was talk of a hospital in the mangrove swamps to the south of the province, and we had, you know how the army's always rivalry. I mean, we were in A Company, so those dickheads down in B Company were in boats and everything, they couldn't find them. So it was our turn to take over, and you know, we've seen what mangrove swamps look like in the tidal mud, etc. And a helicopter pilot reckons he saw something. They used to hover and sometimes get the backwash of and he reckons he saw something in this area. So down we go, and they couldn't land the helicopters in the mud, so they found just a slight clearing in the mangroves, hovered about a foot out of the ground, out we jumped into the mud. And some blokes up their knees in mud. And anyway, we did this for 2 days. And on the next day, suddenly the mangroves just opened up where you could see a lot further. And we came across, it looked like an egg cup, a giant egg cup. And what it was, if you can imagine the way an egg cup is shaped, it just came up and was hollowed out in the centre. And it was old. And we deduced that that was like a century thing. So a bloke could be in there, and when the tide came in, he would be dry. But it was old, but it was still all open. So we went along a bit further, and what we started to notice is that on the edges of the mangroves, there was marks on the bark. And if you can imagine someone on a little boat or something, just nicking the bark, and we could see, and we started to follow these marks. And we come across, it looked like an igloo, and it had been dug out of the ground. You could see the water where it had been dug out a nice triangle, and this igloo looked like an igloo, and it was old as well. And next minute we came across this enemy camp, and of course they scattered as soon as they saw us, and we were very careful how we deployed. We knew there was supposed to be a hospital staging area in there, so we were careful about the rules of engagement. And so we couldn't use artillery because it was a hospital staging area. So what happened, we propped there, and the other half followed all the little muddy footprints where they went, and so they went chasing, and they called in the helicopter gunships, and they said no, under the Geneva Convention we can't do that. So the CO's chopper came out, and he estimated there was about 30 VC in front of our blokes but we're carrying gear and their bare feet running through the mud, probably going for their lives, and they all got away simply because of the rules that we followed, and they all get away. But their camp was amazing. They had, if you imagine a circular area, these igloos were really like bunkers that were built up off the ground above the high tide, and they used to sleep in there in little thatched stretchers. They had tables and chairs like we have at picnic areas made. As well as that, there was poles running around, and they were sitting in little V grooves of sticks, and that's so that they wouldn't have to walk through the mud. So they walked around these poles. They had fresh water there. There was even a fire. They had all these crabs, the crabs all tied up the way you can buy them in the markets. And so they said, well, okay, you guys stay there, they might come back. And we think, stay in the middle of the swamp. So the choppers came over and dropped all their gear out of the chopper, because we were only travelling light. And they had issued us with hammocks, and none of us like to sleep in hammocks, you're too vulnerable. But there's no way we could sleep in the mud. So I remember tying my hammock up, and the mangroves were very weak, So I tied it up as high as I could, and I hopped in there, and I got the radio sitting in this bush and something else. And through the night you could hear the tide coming in. And a couple of blokes slept on mounds that got a bit wet, and you could hear them sloshing around in the water. And I remember putting my hand down underneath the hammock, and I could feel the water, and it was within a fist level of my backside. I thought, I'm going to get wet here, So an infant here has ways of really keeping dry all the time. Anyway, the night was uneventful, and next morning, as day breaks, we looked across the platoon commander, and he's like on the picnic table, sleeping on the table. But what had happened over his weight in the middle of the night, it had sunken down. He was half covered in water, still asleep. So we then took off. We waited for the engineers to come. We had a look around the next morning, and we saw that they did come back to that old area and dug something up out of the ground. So whether they had weapons or not, we don't know. So then they brought the engineers in and blew the place up. We actually took the crabs, and when we got winched up through the choppers were covered in mud, because where it was covered in mud. And the tankies cooked up these crabs for us. Oh, they were beautiful. Well, they could have poisoned them. We could have. But it was amazing. It was so clean that they could live in those muddy conditions, and they were clean. That's what impressed me about the Vietnamese. They can be so clean. So they had it really worked out. So I tried to take pictures of them, but just far too dark. They didn't turn out. So B Company couldn't find them, but we found them. Well, we stumbled upon them.
How trigger happy were the Americans?
We didn't work with them, so some of the units were very good, but they just operated totally different to us. Where we were in the jungle for 4 weeks, and maybe got resupplied 3 times. Their system of resupply was every afternoon, and they just couldn't operate like we did. So you really can't compare. They had just everything with them. Whereas we were sneaking around, and we were engaging small groups. They had some big battles. And I'm glad I wasn't with them, so I liked our war better. It was different, but our war was nothing like you see on TV. So, but the American war was. I mean, I've seen a lot of them, and it's only from the movies that I've seen. But I don't think I could have worked the way they work. It's just a totally different way of operating, that's all. We were small groups getting around the jungle ourselves and dominating the area, whereas they like to size up at the big battle and blow everything up, just like you see. So I didn't see anything firsthand.
And I just wanted to ask you a bit about the camp at Nui Dat and what the conditions were like there. How was it set up?
Nui Dat was about half it was based on a rubber plantation that the infantry units, because we were on the perimeter, were in. It had a large dam. It had a hill in the centre where the SAS were. It had a large runway that used to, the Hercules transports used to come in, and it also had a smaller chopper pad. But we tend to use our own little cleared area for the choppers. But those Hercules, when you'd see them coming in, apparently the runway wasn't quite long enough, and to sit there and watch these things hit the ground at whatever speed and try and pull up, they used to go whack on the ground. Oh, amazing, don't they survive? But we were never in Nui Dat very much at all, and where we were in rows of tents that had just a wooden floor, and they were surrounded by sandbags, and a platoon would be in 3 little rows, then your headquarters. Down further where the wire would be, there would be tracks and tape leading down. There'd be a big gun position. Then there would be a series of barbed wire, and within the barbed wire there'd be booby traps and other things that to make, things to rattle, etc., etc. In the 12 months we were there, there was no attempt by anyone to infiltrate the base, so that was good. There was a couple of false alarms, but so we didn't even have any mortar attacks or anything when we were there. At the time, we didn't spend much time. We'd come in off operations. We'd spend a night there. The next day we'd go down to Vung Tau. We'd spend 2 nights there, come back. Then we'd spend another night in Nui Dat and bang straight back out. So between operations we might only spend 2 nights there. So we were never there. But it was very musty. The tents were old, and but it was good to sleep on a bed. So they're really old, pretty crappy beds. I probably couldn't sleep on it now, but I still remember that musty dampness. It really dried out. And it was fairly dusty too, because you'd walk around just in shorts and you'd be sweaty, and the dust would, we used to call it, when you'd have a shower, washing off the Nui Dat tan. So it was better in the bush, we think. So much so that often when we got back, we were going to be back in for a week, there used to be these patrols that they do just close to Nui Dat. Continuously as part of this patrolling, always patrol the area just around your base. And they called them tail patrols, tactical area of responsibility. And what our section used to do was we would volunteer for them, because back at the base camp, you're doing all the army drudgery stuff, all the jobs, you've got to do this. We'd go back out and we'd be patrolling out, because we'd been out in the big thick jungle, and this was closer to the base where it was all very open, and we regarded it as a bit of a holiday to go on a tail patrol, because we'd been out in the big stuff, and we used to volunteer for the tail patrols. People used to reckon, well, man, we used to reckon it was better out there than doing all the jobs back at the base camp. So,
what kind of news would you get about the war and what was happening?
we got situation reports on what was happening with other groups, the bunker systems they were finding, and of course there was always some with a sense of humour. There was, I mentioned before about pigs, where we were in an ambush and there was pigs, and we spotted that there were pigs. Well, the one of our platoons, I think one platoon, shot up a couple of pigs one night. And anyway, we also were the Anzac Battalion. We had a company of Kiwis with us, and we didn't work directly with them because they had their own settler areas as well. A couple of times we got together back at the base camp. But these big Maoris, they were big fellas, and they would just carry so much gear, and they put fear into everybody. Even us, we were frightened of these big Maoris. And anyway, they raided an orchard. Now I can say within 12 months I don't think I had any fruit. And we actually pinched some fruit somewhere. It tasted like grapefruit, but I think it was just something that was green. But apparently the story goes that the Kiwis raided this garden because they'd be like us, just on rations, so they raid this garden. So here's this news summary about, 3 platoon has come across 2 bunker systems, 2 platoons on this, and 1 platoon who shot 2 pigs last night is going to marry up with Victor Company, and they'll be having a hungy outside the Nui Dat such and such. There used to be jokes like that, so everyone had a sense of humour. But often we really didn't care what someone else was doing. You were so busy working, you were tired. So when these things come around, you might have read it, passed it on, or you're only interested in your immediate stuff or what you were doing. You weren't really interested in what was happening back home. I mean, you had your letters from home about your family, so we used to get magazines, but I can't recall seeing papers. I don't think we got papers at all.
What kind of support would you give those blokes who might get a Dear John letter or bad news from home?
I had a bit of a laugh. It was happening regularly, so it wasn't really, you had your mates, and I don't think it affected them at all. I mean, let's face it, you're away from home for practically 2 years, so I don't know of any married blokes that ran into problems, but obviously they must have had, but I wasn't aware of that. It was mainly only blokes that had a girlfriend and she's written the letter, So, though we used to have a laugh about it. What else could you do? So it must have been hard for the married blokes. I talked to a few blokes that were married, and it's surprisingly, blokes that were married before they went over are still married. So how do you work that out, One lady was telling us that when she went to pick her husband up, it was a total stranger. Been away for 2 years. So that'd be very hard when you're 20, 21, So I suppose if you survive that, you can survive anything.
What kind of things would you do at New Adapt just to entertain yourself in terms of the downtime that you had?
We didn't have much downtime. To give you an idea, we would come in by chopper probably mid-morning. Because we were 2 platoon A company, you had 1 platoon, 2 platoon, 3 platoon. And what they would do, they'd pull out usually company headquarters first or whatever. Then they'd pull out 1 platoon, 2 platoon, 3 platoon. Or they'd change it and pull out 3 platoon, 2 platoon, 1 platoon. So we were always mid-morning. And what they did, they said, righto, we complain. We're never first back, Because getting first back, you get your gear packed, you have a shower and everything, and then your time's your own, you can read your mail and all that sort of stuff. So they'd be all doing that, we're still coming back in, So they said, well, you blokes are first. And righto, it was during the dry season, and what happened is that the previous night you drank all your water and ate all your food and you had nothing left the next day. And you were continually thirsty. So you're waiting, and it was early in the morning, it must have been 8 o'clock or something, because I don't know whether the RAF blokes get up in the dark or not. I think the sun's got up before they get up. And they were coming, and there was a certain procedure on the radio to call them in, and they asked to throw smoke. So you throw the smoke, and they say, oh, we see blue or green or whatever, and you confirm that. Well, we were in shoulder-high grass, and when the bloke threw the smoke grenade, what he should have done was pull the pin, let the percussion cap go while it's still in his hand, and then throw it. But he threw it in the grass, and when the percussion cap went off, it settled right to the grass. The grass was this high. And it just went whoosh, it was tinder dry. And I remember saying to the choppers, said, can you see our smoke? And then I said, look, we got a bit of a problem on the ground, you'll have to come back later. So what happened, we were surrounded by bamboo, very spiky bamboos you can't get through. And we then decided that rather than go back down through the track where we come in, we would jump through the flames. So you had to wait till the flames died down and jump through them. So that was very exciting. And of course, then we missed our opportunity of getting back first. So there we are in this big clearing, and we were vulnerable now because we've got no cover or anything. And we're sitting out there and it's all black, and this bushfire is just, smoke going everywhere and the way it's gone. And we were very vulnerable, but we didn't want to leave the area because we didn't know when they were coming back. So then the choppers called up, because now they could see us down this blackened bit of earth. And that was fine, and there's a certain pattern you get down on the ground, and they can see your pattern, and they come and land, and you hop on, away you go. Once they come in close, if you imagine dry grass burns to a very fine powder, it was just stuff went everywhere. And I recall I was underneath this chopper, and I usually get on the last one, coming out because I've got the radio, and I hear noise. I sort of looked up, and this thing's nearly landing on top of it, so I got out of the way and jumped in it. And then when it took off, you could see there was all these blokes left behind, so I had to come around again and pick them up. And then we get back to Nui Dan, and in the early days, we'd get off the trucks, straight through the canteen, and they give us a can of beer. And you'd down it, well, you've been dehydrated for 4 weeks, and you'd get silly. So after a while, we even said, look, we'd rather have a soft drink. And they used to have those cans of Cotties cordials. and you'd be so parched that you could open them and just completely down it without stopping. You know, usually the gas in them makes you, well, you could just down it, you know. Then we go back up, and already laid out is our rations for 6 days rations again. So we'd have to repack all our gear ready to go. Then we'd have to strip down all our weapons, wash them in fuel and clean them and oil them all up, get them ready to go, and have a shower, and then they would issue our mail. So we never used to muck around. So if they give you the mail first, all you want to do is read your mail. So then we were usually doing some admin stuff. We couldn't really go away anywhere, had to stay around where we were, but there was nothing to do anyway, to go anywhere or do anything. I mean, you just come back from 4 or 5 weeks in the bush. All you want to do is sleep usually. And usually then for tea that night, the cooks have been out scrounging and got prawns and everything else, and we go in, they'd have all this food. Well, you've been eating little tins of stuff for the last 4 or 5 weeks. And what I used to, you get a steak and you get this, and you get halfway through the steak and had 1 prawn and you were full, you know. And as well as that, they give you to be beer there, and you'd have 1 beer and you'd be silly. So I learned after a while was to bypass the steak. I'd get a couple of prawns and some ham. You'd only ever see it all at the end of every operation. We never had that sort of food. Of course, we always joked about the bacon we got, never had any red meat on it. And so the cooks, we had good cooks, they used to scrounge and get stuff for us and put on a big spread. And then we were all usually got rotten drunk that night, but you couldn't drink too much because the next day early getting on the trucks to go down to Vung Tau. So it was probably cunning the way they did it, because you knew they're going in the trucks. If you're a cook, you're not going to enjoy your 36 hours off. So at times, though, we might have been back there for a week with retraining or manning the machine guns, because the base camp had to be protected. So there were duties to do back there. But we didn't really have much spare time, and you tend to just sit around with your mates and sleep, or didn't do anything. They might have had a volleyball thing, but you know, you just needed to rest really. So they didn't. Oh, they had movies. They had a cinema. You had to take your own chair and sit there and watch the movies. And the greatest thing about the movies was there was open air, and they had a projector up there somewhere, and they had a fixed screen. And whatever the movie was, it didn't matter what it was. You joined in the movie by cheering blokes on, and you know, if there was a love scene, you'd be saying all these appropriate comments of encouragement, you know, on the love scene. It was really a great way to watch a movie. You never knew what the dialogue was, but you know, when the hero would come in, you'd be all cheering, and so the movies were good. I never saw enough of them. Nui so that was Nui. Yeah.
What did you see of refugees?
We did see some, well, we were told they were Cambodian refugees, and they were just in tents along the side of the highway once we went past, but that's about all we saw. I don't think it was, I'm not even sure why they were there, or what the story was, because we were uneducated as to what was happening. You know, we're only worried about our little world, so... but really we just did our platoon grind 24 hours a day.
I'll ask you about what it was like to leave Vietnam, that last few days just before you're ready to go. What's the emotion like at that time?
We were in the field till 2 days before we come home, so we were continually in the field, but we became... on operations, and our last operation, we become very cautious, because now we realised, let's not take any risks. And I remember we were then operating as a company, so we were all together in a big push, because some of the theory was if they know a group's leaving, then they'll come and give them a hit. It happened to 4 RAR that they end up hitting the NVA. And I recall we were operating as a company, and we used to hate it because that blokes were so slow, you know. And we talked at nursemaid in company headquarters. We couldn't get out and operate the way we used to in little groups sneaking around. And we come across, you get a feel for a bunker system. It tends to be when there's a bit of a rise in the ground, where the trees are a certain size that would make good support for their bunkers. And we come across then some fresh cuttings, and we propped. And I remember hearing the boss over the radio saying, I think we had 3 days to go. And I remember him saying, no, we don't want anything silly happening this time. and we actually just moved out of the area. So I was surprised at that. I couldn't understand why we were out there, but we had two company commanders. Our second company commander, he was excellent, really looked after the troops, so I think he made the command decision to say, whoops, we've got 3 days to go. The last thing we want is to really hit something now and let it all turn to, I was going to say turn to shit, but so I remember hearing that on the radio, and I don't know whether I discussed that with anybody. But I remember the morning we were going out, and I had this packet of shaving cream, and one of the things you were doing in Vietnam was doing a countdown whenever you met someone. The joke used to be, no one's got 365 days in a wakey. That's what they used to, the jargon. You say, well, what's this wakey? Well, they say, well, say you're going home in 10 days. All right, so you don't count today, and you don't count the last day. So that means if you've got 10 days to go, in effect that's 8 and a wakey. You say, well, what's this wakey? Well, that's where someone wakes you up and says, oh, it's time to go home. So the joke was when someone's new, no one has 364 days in a wakey. So you're always counting down how long you met someone, say, 30 in a wakey, don't go crook. So I wrote in shaving cream, 3 in a wakey, I remember on a track, and I think the boss came along and scrubbed it all out, but anyway. So that's how I know we're in the bush till we're ready to go home. So how did I feel about going home? I couldn't wait to get out of the place. And, they've been building up for a long time, and unfortunately we went back would have liked to have flown home. But we got on the aircraft carrier, which was harboured off Vung Tau. And I still remember the big Chinooks. It was kind of a beautiful scene with the Sydney sitting there, and when we landed on the flight deck, there was a guy from my hometown, Cavanough, with 4 RAO who were replacing us. And they were in Delta Company, and I thought to myself, we're A Company. And normally they swap the companies over, but 4 didn't have an A Company, so I thought, oh, Delta Company. So I remember scanning these blokes, looking for this. And there's this bloke waving to me. Well, last time I saw him was a kid, now he was filled out a bit. So, and then when we were going down to our quarters, well, it wasn't really quarters, it was just an area. We're given a hammock in an area this size, 20 by 20, and there'd be 30 blokes in it. And I ran into another bloke from Cootamundra who was in the Navy, so 2 blokes from my hometown of 6,000 people. So then our cooks we were each given a duty, we just couldn't do nothing. So my duty was that one of the days had to go and help these blokes scrub this wooden floor. And so that's all I had to do for a half day. And it turned out it was a Saturday. We're getting stuck into it, and the bloke said, ooh, slow down, this has got to last us, a couple of hours to do this job. The rest of the time we just laid around, did nothing in the sun, and we got on this boat, and we'd turn up, like breakfast would be 7:30, we're down there at 6:30, wanting something to eat, so all our cooks were then cooking earlier, and I can honestly say that was, we had roast lamb with mint sauce, hadn't had that for over 12 months, hadn't had fresh bread, hadn't had fresh butter. Just all those things we'd never had, when we were all just grueling with all this food. And we gorged ourselves for whatever it was, 8 days for our ride to Townsville, sunning ourselves, and so we were still skinny as anything by the time we got to Townsville, so we must have been a wreck when we come out of the jungle, so I think we would have been fattened up a bit. Maybe that's what they were trying to do.
What was the emotion when you sighted the coast of Australia?
Well, we were in good spirits all the way. And really, it did become tiring because you were waiting for it to happen, Yeah.
So you've been in good spirits all the way back on the...
Oh, yes, and then because you're going home, it becomes tiring because you're just waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting for it to happen. So I think all up we were travelling non-stop 10 days by the time I got back to Sydney. We were just sort of buggered at that stage. So it wasn't a big climax or anything, it was just tired out.
How did you know that when you came back it wasn't that you didn't want to advertise it? What gave you that indication?
We came back on an aircraft carrier. A lot of fellas flew back, but we came back at the end of our tour. On the aircraft carrier we came across the top of Australia and docked at Townsville. We got off at Townsville, marched through the streets of Townsville. We then were thrown on a train to Brisbane, overnight to Brisbane. We were left for about 4 hours in Brisbane because we had to change trains. We got on another train then to Sydney. The train heading south was just a troop train with all us soldiers on it. Of course, we all went a bit crazy. A lot of us had duty-free alcohol. I had 2 bottles of Johnny Walker label, red label. I think my father would have liked it. And that was confiscated from us. I mean, I travelled with the stuff from Vietnam because we got a duty-free. And at Brisbane it was confiscated. We assumed that when we got out of the train in Sydney we would get it back, but we never saw it. While we were in Brisbane there was an MP come up and abused us because we didn't have our hats on. Because in those days you still had uniform on. Abused us for not wearing our hats, our slouch hat. I was carrying it. The reason I wasn't wearing it was because it was too windy. And he pulled up and just berated us. And we all stood there, and I think we told him where to go. In no uncertain terms. We thought, what the hell's going on here? And then we were surrounded by MPs at Brisbane and practically all strip shirts and stuff taken off us. Then they guarded us all the way to Sydney. My parents then were living in Sydney, and somehow they found out we got off at Central Railway Station. So we'd been travelling, I suppose, 10 days straight at this stage on the aircraft carrier and then 2 days on the train. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I remember seeing my mother, but I can only see her for a few seconds because they threw us on the truck and out to Watson's Bay. So we heard it on this truck, and Blake says, well, what are you blokes doing out here? We said, well, we're going to be discharged. No, can't do that here, got to go to Ingleburn. So back in the truck, out to Ingleburn. Get up there, Blake says, well, it's a bit late today, you boys will have to come back tomorrow. And of course, all we wanted to do was to get out. And so luckily, there was a bloke from B Company, and he lived at Maroubra. And somehow he knew the train system, so my parents were living in Waverley. So I got back there, and he picked me up next morning and said, well, we drove out to Ingleburn and I got discharged from the army. But before I left, I had to pay for a piece of webbing that on our book where they record what you've been issued and what's been returned. It was left off, it wasn't ticked. And he said, where's your webbing? I said, well, it's back at Dewey Dad. I said, we left it there for blokes coming after you to have spares, you know. Oh, we'll have to pay for that. I said, yeah, you got to be. And of course, the attitude, even within the army to you, was very belligerent, and we just couldn't get over this. We were aware that there was a lot of demonstrations and things like that. So even within the army. Anyway, they had to give us a medical before we left. And I remember the fella gave me a hearing test, and I couldn't hear a couple of the tones. And I said to him, oh, what about those couple of tones I can't hear? He said, oh, there's nothing to worry about. Then I had to go down to the dental unit, down to go to the dental unit. And he looks at my mouth and said, oh yes, you need 3 fillings. I said, oh. And I'm thinking, well, is he going to do them now? He said, yeah, we can do that for you. He said, we can fit you in 3 weeks' time. I said, 3 weeks' time? You've got to be joking. He said, oh, you can sign this form and we can let you go now. Give me the form. So I signed the form. So no dental work. And anyway, we're just discharged. No ceremony, no nothing, just gone. And went to my parents' place in Waverley. I'm sitting around this. Luckily, I'd had 10 days travelling to get used to things. I pity the poor blokes that flew home by plane. I mean, it was so alien that I would go to the toilet and I'd come out of the toilet. My mother would say, "Did you flush the toilet?" And I'd go back and flush the toilet. So even little things like that. Couldn't walk down the street. You were forever always looking at stuff. And I still do, always looking and watching, you know. So that never leaves you. And then when, oh that's right, and I got in touch with the Forest Commission where I used to work, going to work in their head office. And met a few people I knew a few years before, but really no one really wanted to know anything about the Vietnam War, so all you did was just lock that away and just got on with your job. So you told nobody about it. You didn't mention it because a Vietnam veteran in the 70s was really an idiot. You know, what the hell were you doing in that war? Irrespective of that, about half of the blokes in Vietnam were Nashos anyway. So it was a very terrible time. And the worst part is that everybody was an expert. They knew all about the Vietnam War, but mainly they were all concerned about the demonstration. You know, parallel now is we don't really hear what's happening in Iraq. We only hear about how badly the Bush administration has handled this. So you tend to have a view, and that's what the Vietnam War was. A view was portrayed a certain way, and I have yet to see one positive story about the Vietnam War. So it was sad. You just switched off, and when you're a young bloke, you can do that, you know. So you just got on with it.
So that thing of locking it away in the cupboard, how does that work later on? What happens?
Oh, you realise later that it's got to come out at some stage. Or I read somewhere, or what I've done the last 5 or 6 years is really educated myself into how the body responds to stuff. You know, knowledge is power, isn't it? You know, to find out things. And I remember someone reading somewhere that you can do anything you like. It's no problem. You can tell your body, no, we'll forget about that or whatever, but your body fights back. And it will manifest itself in some other way. So any trauma that you've had and want to get over, so if you've been in a car accident or whatever, you say, yep, I'll put that behind me, but what happens, you know, you get sleep disturbance, and you get flashbacks, and you get all these things start to sort of creep up behind you, and you then are trying to look at some ways of maintaining control. A lot of blokes, you know, immerse themselves in alcohol and drugs, and so that coping mechanism. But it takes, to me, about 20 years to sort of really come up, and then it's, at that stage, it's really too late, you know, the damage is done, isn't it, you know. So, oh no, it's a sad time. Yeah, well, no, not a sad time. I think it's sad that the public view of the war was just so negative. That's what was sad. They didn't see the positives that I saw happening in Vietnam. They didn't understand why the war started in the first place, what was happening to the people of South Vietnam. You know, and as with any war, once it's going longer than a couple of months, we all just want to finish, no matter what the outcome. So,
do you think people are any wiser now?
they think they are, but no. I mean, it's like the more I researched what these fellas went through in the First World War, I'm just glad I wasn't there. Some of the stuff they did. So people who research the Vietnam War are probably more into the political history of it. I've read a few soldier books, but I suppose the people who would read those would be soldiers or military people who find an interest in that. But I don't think the average person would probably read those type of books. They might see a movie. What was that movie with the Australian fellow was in? We Were Soldiers, or We Were Young, and Mel Gibson. And I read the book. The book was fantastic. They operated a lot like we did. It was a very good book. When I saw the movie, well, I didn't really like it. I thought it was a bit like Cowboys and Indians. I don't think it portrayed... Well, what it tried to do, it's like if you spent 5 years in high school and they're going to make a movie of you in high school and everything they put into it, you think, my God, and they just cram everything in. But from the day-to-day stuff, it wasn't like that. They just take all the things that happened in a school and, you know, what would we put in if we spent, there'd be where we have, you know, we'd have these shoot-ups, wouldn't we? They'd show that, they'd show this. So what these movies become is unrepresentative. But people look at them and think, that's what it was like, and they maintain a view. So the view most people have is really incorrect, you know. The only movie that I really liked, that I thought was spot on, was Odd Angry Shot, which is an Australian movie that I don't think you can get on video even. It was a tremendous movie, had a bit of a laugh. And
how close, I watched that film probably about 6 weeks ago, how close is
spot
that?
on all the way. The thing the Australians have is humour, and you know, we see all the American movies and their culture is totally different to ours. The Australian way of coping with someone is to have a go at your mate. You know, that's the way Australians band together and bond, is that we can take the mickey out of each other, and that only strengthens our mateship. The Americans are all about speeches and the flag, but the Australians, it's all about mateship and a strong bond there. So it's really totally different, you know.
You said that you'd grown up on 50s films about World War II, and there were a series of, I guess we went through a stage where there were a series of Vietnam War films made in the 80s. Did any of those come close to what it was like in terms of the combat situation?
In my experience, no, way off. Because what they tended to focus on was negative aspects of war. Now, war is not a nice thing, but there are positives. And what they also, and I suppose if I wanted to make a movie, I'd probably tend to cram everything in too, to show people what the war was about. But it's usually, it's like a Forrest Gump. Beautiful story, all these things happen to him, but really it's just a lot of things that were common in the time. You know, I remember the way he taught this bloke to dance, and we realised, oh, that was Elvis and Apple computers. And so what you see in a war movie is all these things tied together, usually with one central main character who it tends to be in charge, and usually with most Vietnam movies there's some negative connotation attached to it, you know. Not only the death and suffering, but usually there's some political connotation where you know, there's corruption involved, and have a look at those Rambo movies, you know, things like that. So they're all over the top. Whereas the Vietnam War for me, which was an infantry soldier, was that we were sneaking around the jungle all the time, and we were really hitting the enemy before they even knew we were there. So our war was totally different to what you see in the movies. And the other thing, you know, when you see an explosion now, well, when you see an explosion, most of the explosion is dust and debris. There's no big flash of flames. Yet, but if you don't have the flash and flames, even in a car accident now, people think, oh. So really the movies distort reality. So completely different. So how do you tell everybody that, well, no, it wasn't like that, it was different. So our war was different. We were in a province, Phuoc Tuy province, which had a lot of insurgents. The way they're operating was the North were coming down, and they were trying to win over the people on the South, and they would do it by killing people. A lot of bad things were happening, and the problem you had was that the South were being sort of led by a corrupt government. So it was really a bad situation. I suppose there was never a way. Maybe you should have all sat back and let it happen. And one could say, well, that's what happened anyway. But certainly where we were, we dominated Phuoc Tuy province. Really, whenever, in the time that I was there, we knew they were there before. So what the enemy would do, they would come in and they would have bunker systems built, ready for a big push to come in. And what our job do was just keep them out of the province. So intelligence would say, look, there's some activity here. So out we'd go, and we'd be out for 3 or 4 weeks just sneaking around looking for them. We'd look for tracks. We'd always look for water courses, and from the water course you'd find tracks. And so we really dominated the place. Yet that's not what sort of gets shown. And we were only in about 2 big battles in the time. All ours were fleeting battles with small groups. As soon as we hit them, they would just flee. So, and really, if a camera had been there, you wouldn't see anything anyway, because in the jungle you just can't see anything. So I guess it's like anywhere. If things are going well and running well, that's not news. Well, they say, dog bites man isn't news, but man bites dog is. So we didn't have any men biting dogs. We just got on with the job. So.
You said that when you walk down the street now, you're still on the lookout for things.
Yes.
Can you walk me through what that experience is like from leaving the front door?
It's more so now. I'm really over it, but it used to manifest itself if you went on a picnic anywhere, into a park. You couldn't relax because you're taught to. If in the jungle when you're there, you can be 25 yards away from the enemy and not know they're there. And the hardest thing, and years later in the army trying to teach people, is that when you look through the foliage, and it's a bit like with a camera, that if you have a tree 25 yards away, you can focus on the tree and everything behind it's blurry. But if you focus on 100 metres, you can then see through the tree. And that's what we were trained to do, to really look through stuff. And even a movement of a shadow or anything like that you would pick up very easily. To me, what usually picked up was any type of different movement. Straight away you twigged onto it. So on a picnic, therefore, you were continually scanning whatever was happening. You know, it was just something you automatically did. Whenever you went into a room or whatever, you were aware of the exits, and you would stand somewhere against the wall or the side. You weren't paranoid, it was just something that you had done and never leaves you. For example, my number 2 son was always picking stuff up in the street, you know, if there was a box there or something. And I used to go crook at him till someone pointed out to me or asked me, well, what are you going crook at? I said, well, he shouldn't be picking it up. So you weren't inquisitive. If there was a box there on the ground, you walked around and kept going. And it's a bit like now that with terrorism, you know, if anyone sees a briefcase now, they won't touch it. So it's that type of thing. We become aware of anything, and you pick up body language on people, eyes a bit shifty or whatever. So you're always observing, always, and it doesn't leave you. So,
is there any way to deprogram that?
I think knowledge. If I had known that, instead of experiencing it, then someone pointing out to you, well, hang on, because you aren't aware that you're doing a lot of things because it's automatic. It's only when someone points things out to you, you say, oh. And once the knowledge comes, that's the reason I joined the Army Reserve, because I couldn't enjoy the bush. I was just... anxiety levels really just went up, and because with the forestry I was working in the office, but occasionally you'd go out and I was forever scanning and looking, and I was aware then, that was in the 70s, that I had a bit of a problem, and I couldn't enjoy the bush, and I didn't have the chance to join the reserves till about 1980. And I joined the reserve because I thought, if I do it all again, you know, if I get myself, go back and do it all again, I'll get over this, whatever it is I've got. Because now we all talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, but when you're on your own and things are happening to you, all you can do is try to do things best you can yourself. Whereas 20 years later, we all have all the studies and this and that, and we can read and educate ourselves. So that's why a lot of blokes used to drink, and I was never a drinker. So I just confronted it all again. That's the way I tried to overcome the problems I was having. But I told no one about it. I just kept it to yourself.
So what sort of effect does that have on the relationship with your family or marriages or relationships with women?
Well, you tell them nothing. Because that's what big male macho men do. You just deal with it. Comes from my upbringing, doesn't it? My parents you just get on with it. Do what you've got to do. And even though your heart is thumping through your chest, you just get on and do it. That's what you do. And you only realise later that all you're doing is making it worse. But at the time, what other option is there? You can't go and talk to somebody in the early days, because I think really Vietnam veterans were portrayed as whingers and losers, and so you just drummed it all down and got on with it. So didn't discuss it with anybody, or because you didn't want to appear weak. You know, if you had lost an arm or lost a leg, then people can see. People can't see the hearing loss or the other problems you got, you know.
So what is the personal cost of that then, of suppressing that?
I think you become emotionally numb, because showing emotion is a sign of weakness. And I think that comes from the army training. I mean, when you're involved in a skirmish, the object is to secure what it is you're doing. So that means clearing the enemy that are ahead, or if they've taken away, clearing the areas so you know that they have gone. At the same time, if one of your fellows is injured or wounded or whatever, you can't go back and look after him yet, because if you do that, then there's a security problem for the rest of the group. And here's where I find continually funny with American movies, is that they have this big thing about calling it medic and this and that. Well, our way was, let's secure the area, let's get rid of the enemy, let's do this job, then we go back and get our mate. And we all knew that's the way, because there's no other way to do it. If you don't do that, you then open yourself out to be counter-attacked or whatever. So it's quite easy to suppress that. And the other thing too is that even though you were all a little bit scared, you don't say to your mate, oh, geez, I'm scared, mate. Or you will make a joke, or you will say nothing, because I think it's infectious that if you're a little bit worried, and you're all a little bit worried, that's not what you want. You must remain. So that's where the humour used to come in. On some terrible circumstances, you'd sort of look at each other and pull a face or do something ridiculous. I mean, that's what it was like. It wasn't like what you said, the Americans, where you see it time and time again. Someone gets wounded, so they're going out to get him. Well, no, leave him there till we've done the job, then go and get him. So I think it's that suppression of caring, or the emotional side of it. No, get on, do the job, and then fix people up. And I think that becomes easy then to do that in life. Whatever happens, let's just move on. Let's just get going. Oh, well, that happens. Shrug the shoulders, keep going. You don't realise later that you really need to talk that out, to discuss things, to why this happened. But that didn't happen for another 20 years. And by then the damage was done, and probably the damage to your family was done. And it's only now that you realise that, oh, okay, maybe we should. And there are support systems around now that certainly I've used. And but I suppose at the time, it's just something you learn, you know. We know now that should happen 20 years ago, and certainly I think it happens to the fellows coming back from Iraq or Timor.
Was there any talk amongst you and the blokes that came back when you were experiencing those feelings of, oh, this is a bit weird because I'm walking down the street and I'm still looking out for VC? Or
I first spoke to fellas about that in 98. So that was, we left there in 71. So that's 30 years, is it? 32 years. That's where I first spoke about it. Because what happened to us, unlike, again, the Second World War fellas, who usually went to school together, enlisted together, fought together, come home together, started that great organisation they had. What happened to us is that we were pulled in from all over the place, trained together, went overseas, got back and got out. And I knew where two blokes were. One was at Rye Park and one was on the Central Coast. And that's all I knew. I didn't know where anyone else was. I mean, I knew blokes were in Western Australia and blokes were in Queensland, because all you wanted to do was just to get away and forget about it. And then with the Welcome Home Parade, we got together again in Sydney. But a strange thing happened. Because everything happened so quickly, and we were just very emotional time and caught up in it, and bang, it was gone. And I had a couple of addresses, but it was just bang and gone, and when it was over, that's when your depression set in, because you realise, wow, you know, and you didn't get a time to discuss things. And then there was the one in Canberra, the dedication memorial, and I remember saying, and we were in this, I think it was called Reed Park, which was about a kilometre or so from where they're having the dedication ceremony. They've got the big TV screens up there, and the Prime Minister and all these dignitaries are there. And I remember saying to the blokes, I said, hang on a minute, there's something wrong here. I said, this is the dedication of our memorial. I said, so where's all the Vietnam veterans? We're all up here in Reed Park, a kilometre away from it. And down there where the dedication ceremony is all the politicians and all the hierarchy and everything else. Well, hang on a minute, we should be down there. And I really thought that was strange. I just couldn't believe it. Decided to seek out the Vietnam vets locally, and then filled out a bit of a claim form, and then started my road to diagnosis of all my problems. And they sent me to all these specialists, and that's when I knew I was sort of not in trouble at that stage, but I was a lot better than I realised. That's when I got hearing aids. So I started to realise that, well, maybe I wasn't in as great a shape. So I thought it was all a bit of an illusion, you know. And then I went downhill for a while. I was working in an office, and I'd always prided myself on being methodical, logical, organised, because that's the army way. And I was aware that I was going a bit scattered. I was aware that I sort of things weren't going right. And I was talking on the phone to this lady. I'd met her once, and I didn't really know about talking about something. And she said to me, I can still remember, she said to me, Ian, you need to go and see a GP. And that just stopped me in my tracks. Why would this person say I need to go and see a GP? And that really just sort of floored me. 10 years earlier, I had a friend who said, look, you need to go and talk to someone. I thought, well, what's wrong with them? You know? So here I am 10 years later thinking, geez, what's going on? So I went up to the ladies in the office, and I stood there and I said, and I didn't really believe this, but I made this statement. I said to them, you know, I'm totally disorganised. I'm just a total mess. And I thought they'd say, don't be silly, you know. They both sat there looking at me, and they both were just nodding. And I thought, my God. So I went off to the GP, and he gave me a month off just like that. I came back, and 3 days, and I walked out of the place. So then I came back again, and I remember, I thought, no, I just can't do this, you know. And you think about it, I've been working for, since I was 18, I was 52 or so, and took pride in what I did, you know, and always reckoned I was really on top of things, and an innovator of things, an innovator of new technology, always looking at how to do things more efficiently, really all the time refining what we did, you know, really, really on top of things. And I remember walking in the boss's office, as cool as anything, and saying to him, I said, I've had it, that's it. I remember him just looking at me, and I thought I'd be nervous, or I'd be sort of, but I was just so calm, because I knew I had to really stop doing what I was doing. I just wasn't in control anymore. And I still recall that, how calm I was when I said to him, look, I just can't keep going. And work was very good, you know. I had to go and see some people, and really it wasn't a problem. I suppose as soon as you mentioned the word Vietnam veteran, I tick the box and away you go, but I was really in trouble, and probably the last one to admit it. But it was more a, you know, concentration, memory, all those sorts of things. I just had no time for anybody. So it just suddenly come up and whacked, hit me. So it must have been coming, and it was amazing how I fell over in it, because while I was over in Perth in '98, I was talking to one of my mates, and I said, no, a few of the blokes have stopped working. I said, no, I'm right. I said, keep working. I think it was 12 months later I fell over, just come and hit me that hard, and I was 52. I just couldn't believe it. So after all that work I'd done of trying to sort out my problems by going back into the army and the Army Reserve and doing stuff again, all it did was delayed it, you know. So it's an amazing thing when it hits you. So, but you can't talk to anyone about it, because to me you feel weak or a whinger or whatever it is, but there comes a time where you know you just can't survive now, you've got to do something. So it hits you like a ton of bricks, it does. And then you've got to fight all your way back, all your self-esteem and everything, you know. So I can still see some of my mates, I mean, one of our mates in West Australia is still working. He is going at 3 million mile an hour. And we're saying to him, listen, mate, you got to give this away. But he's just 3 million mile an hour he's going. So that's what a lot of us do now, is we help each other. Because once you get over that obstacle and then start to do all these things that professionals are getting you to do, you do become so much better, so much more at ease with life. And I was going to use the word content. And to get there is a very nice place to be, so that you want your other mates who you can see really struggling, but they're the last ones to admit it or to acknowledge it. So we're in the process now of really helping each other. So we've really come together again after 30 years. And we had a reunion 2 years ago here in Wollongong. And we're having another one in a month's time in Brisbane. And all the blokes that didn't come are coming to Brisbane. So it's going to be really good.
How do you help them?
Well, I suppose you deprogram them, I suppose. What it is, they've got to tell their story. No matter how inconsequential it seems, to them it's very important. To give you an example how some blokes are really worried. We had a particular incident where a bloke was killed, another bloke wounded. And one of the blokes who didn't come to a reunion 2 years ago, I was talking on the phone, I was pretty good mates with him. And I should say that it took us 2 years to find everybody, searching through on the internet, on the white pages. Went through DVA. It's a very hard system. You say, look, we want to get in touch with these blokes, and they can't tell you where they live because of privacy, but they'll get in touch with them. And we found a bloke last week, and so I think we're up to about 44 blokes now out of 50 we found. So we're doing quite well. And anyway, I went and saw our platoon commander. He was actually wounded, and there was another wounded bloke. And I thought, when we're having this reunion, I've got to get these two blokes to the reunion, because the blokes will want to know what they're like. So I go down to our platoon commander. At that stage, I wasn't really mates with him. He was the boss, and I was just a private. But now we're quite good mates now. And he lives down near my hometown of Cootamundra, so there's a change. And I said to him, oh look, I'm having this problem with the blokes. I said, they've all got this guilt feeling. I said, they're all carrying this terrible guilt, burden of guilt. And I gave the fellow up the Central Coast, I said, well, he's really upset, because when this fellow got killed, he was back at our base camp at Nui Dat. And he feels very guilty, because if he had been out there, he might have been able to do something. And you sort of say to him, well, listen, mate, you're being silly. And so he talked to other blokes, this happened, if only I'd done that, or if only this happened. And I know my own experience, there's a certain amount of guilt that I overcome also in that same episode. So I'm talking to this platoon commander, and I said, all these blokes are carrying this bloody guilt. He looked at me and he said, I feel the same way. I said, what do you mean? He said, I let the blokes down. I shouldn't mention that he's got an artificial leg sitting there, And I said, you've got to be joking. What do you mean you let the blokes down? He said, yeah, I had to leave them. So this guilt is this amazing thing that someone who's wounded, almost killed, still carries the scars now, still thinks about the fact that he let the blokes down. I can't just begin to understand that. But it showed me how everybody is suffering from this guilt. And I went to a course a couple of years ago, and they talk about guilt and grief. And to me, that was the biggest single thing affecting Vietnam veterans.
And you were talking about the guilt that a lot of Vietnam veterans carry. What have you done to deal with your own emotions about the war? What kind of strategies have you got in place?
Well, I wasn't aware of it till about 2 years ago, and I went off and did this course on post-traumatic stresses. I went for about 3 months, a couple of days a week. And the only reason I went on the course, because I thought, I don't need to do this, because there's nothing much wrong with me. Bearing in mind the course covers things like anger management, substance abuse and all this. I was never much of a drinker, and calmed down a lot over the years. I wasn't very angry. But I thought at one stage I'd probably want to be a bit of an advocate or something. So the only reason... I was told about this course and there's a 4-year waiting list. We want to put your name down. I said, oh, yeah, okay. And the bloke said, oh, it's a very good course and this and that. And I suppose because the organisation are funded by DVA, so they've got to keep their workflow going. So 2 weeks later I got rung up and say, look, we've got a vacancy on this course. And I'm thinking, didn't really want to go, And I don't really need to do this. I'm travelling pretty good. And so I thought, oh, well, okay, I'll go along. And so I went, and look, it was fantastic. There was a group of 9 of us. Most of us were infantry. We're all army. And we just all bonded straight away. And we just never stopped laughing the whole 10 weeks, whatever it was. We're in the middle of these very heavy topics and we're cracking jokes. Because that's the way we cope with it all. And the great thing about the course was that the staff were very experienced and they used to just let it go. We just, whenever we're doing something, no matter how, and someone would make a smart comment, of course. Then when someone makes one smart comment, someone else has got to top it. And so this is the way we all interact, it was just as if we've known these blokes all our lives. And I got this warped sense of humour. We were talking about, I think it was anger management, but they had a similar sort of strategy for, and I'll get to grief in a minute, a similar sort of strategy of dealing with things about, I think when you're sort of out of control, you've got to do this grounding thing, so you go through the breathing and work out where you are and all that sort of stuff. So they suggested that, whatever works for you of calming yourself down, you write down on a card so that when you're having a panic attack or whatever, you pull this card out and you go through the motions of getting your breathing down and just really the common sensing of calming yourself down. Well, halfway through this very heavy topic, this vision popped into my head of the American comedian Woody Allen having a panic attack on a train and pulling out his card and reading it and trying to follow it. And I had this, and I still see it today. So any of that sort of stuff I really can't take seriously, even though it's meant to help those that are, really having problems. I just get this amazing, funny view of it. And the worst part of the course was was called grief. And to me, it really opened my eyes. I was unaware of, in grief, they talk about loss as well. And we started to discuss some of the things that the 2 years, what did you miss out on? And I was amazed at how we all had a similar pattern, how we all left our friends and family at the same time when they were all developing relationships and getting married. We went off in this totally alien world while our mates were getting married and going through that stage of life. We were in your late teens, early 20s, and all the things we missed out on. My 21st birthday I had in Vietnam. And how then when we came back to Australia, we wanted to hook up from where we left off. And all our mates have moved on. And suddenly you're sort of, well, not still in party mode, but you sort of want to do the stuff you used to do, go out and get on the grog and go where it's all happening. But they're now married and at home and they may have a kid. So they have progressed socially and you haven't. So I recognised that was a big loss. I hadn't realised that. And socially, you really couldn't mix socially because you were just sort of a moron, because for 2 years you'd been only dealing with blokes and the way we used to talk to each other. And so you didn't have any verbal skills left anymore, and let alone the work situation. You were just you were the alien, And then on top of that, the problem we're having in society with Vietnam veterans, it was just as if, well, my God, what am I doing here? It was just such an alien thing. So that was a big thing that when we went that day, that grief and loss really knocked us all around. I remember really got to us because I was unaware of the enormity of the things just that 2 years did, So what happens in the future when Buck Rogers comes back after 50 years, So grief and loss is the single biggest thing. Yep.
You mentioned earlier that the Vietnam War was the last big war of its kind that Australia has fought in. we're also getting to a time where World War II veterans are at an age where, you know, people are dying from that era. There's going to be a time soon when the Vietnam veterans are the last remaining veterans after the Korean War and the Second World War. How different is the culture of the Vietnam veterans, do you think, from previous generations of Australian war veterans?
I think a lot of us got big chips on our shoulders. I think there's no doubt we're treated bad. And you've got to understand that, I don't know, 50,000 or something were national servicemen who the government decided to call them into the army. So you layer that on with an uncaring government, uncaring public, and the portrayal of the Vietnam veteran in movies as baby killers and doped up and really negative imagery. And then 20, 25 years later to say, well, look, boys, all's forgiven. I think that's too late for a lot of veterans, and they're really struggling. And the only place they're finding solace is in their brethren. You know, that's why we're continually now seeking each other out. Not that we need to swap war stories or engage in, you know, warmongering. It's not that at all. It's just this unwritten rule where you can just sit down and say nothing. It's just a matter of being with your mates, and that's all it is. And so I don't think you'll see the Vietnam veterans en masse like you did the Second World War fellows, because as a group, I don't think we care. I mean, there's been no positive portrayal of Vietnam veterans. We have one politician, that's a Vietnam veteran, he's from Western Australia. The policies that come out in support of veteran stuff really is now to save the government money rather than look after the veteran. So things change when people refer to someone as a returned serviceman. Then suddenly we become a veteran. And that connotation of the veteran with problems is what signifies the Vietnam veteran. And I said to a group one day, I carry the stigma of being a Vietnam veteran, because somewhere along the line someone decided that Vietnam veterans were a bunch of losers, and it just keeps self-perpetuating itself. So really the only thing we can do, the government won't support us. The RSL's changed a lot now with a lot of Vietnam veterans, but we've still got a lot of bad memories about it. And so the only ones that we can rely on are our mates, which is really sad, you know, really unfortunate. But that's the way I feel. And for people to say, oh, we did the bad thing by the Vietnam veterans, we won't let it happen. Well, I still would like to come face to face with a demonstrator and say, what is it that you are demonstrating against? And I've only found one lady who, when they talk about the Vietnam era, and once they find out that you're a Vietnam veteran, of course whether they feel intimidated. But I said to this one lady who was going to university, I said, why did you go and do the demonstrations, and why are the demonstrations taken out against the soldier? You know, why was the focus against the soldier? And her answer was, well, it was either that or go to, and she must mention some lecture she had to go to. So for her it was just a bit of a lark. So of all these people with the demonstrations, I mean, how many of them actually believed that there should be no war, and how many were just doing it for something to do? And in the result, I mentioned that the war finished in 1968 with the Tet Offensive, where the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were a spent force. Until 1972 it dragged on because the North Vietnamese won the propaganda battle. And it was because of people who were uninformed saying, well, the war is going badly. Well, it wasn't going badly at all, it was just the way it was reported. Because certainly the Australians never lost a battle. And the Americans might get hit a couple of times, but basically they were unbeatable as well. It's just that their political will in their country didn't allow the soldier to fight the battle that the soldier fought. So if a politician says to a soldier, you go off to war, the politician should go back into his office and wait for the soldier to come back and say the war is now over. But where you got the politician who is a non-military person dictating the rules that we will fight by, straight away you just can't win. So I find it amazing that a politician will put his soldiers into war and then be horrified as to what's happening. I mean, you know, it's a game you play for keeps, and that's the way you got to play. The way you got to play it.
And we're near the end of the day, so I just have one last question that I wanted to ask you. If you could have your way, and in 30 years' time someone was looking at this archive and re-evaluating the role that the Vietnam veterans played in Australia's military history, what kind of message would you like to give out about the role that you played?
I don't know the role that I played, but the Australian Vietnam veteran at the time was the best trained we sent over, who participated in battle-like conditions continuously for a 12-month period. In my own experience, we had 318 operational days in 12 months. Whereas you look at the First World War or the Second World War, that they were involved in a big battle and then they had a couple of months off, and they were involved. Well, we were continuously on the go for a 12-month period. Admittedly, they might have been for 5 years, but if you take down the amount of days, we were certainly far ahead of the type of battles that they were having. So the Vietnam veteran was really exhausted on the battlefield to an uncaring public back home, and there's no way that damage can be repaired. And all the mental images that on Vietnam is of that the girl that lives in Canada now coming back with her skin dripping off, but there's no stories about the good things the Australians achieved in Phuoc Tri province. And to me, I think we need to turn to the South Vietnamese and ask them, what did they think of the Australians? Because we were building roads, the hospital and the orphanage in Berea, and we were playing the game fair in the way it should be played, playing it tough and doing it right. But I've yet to see that in print. And if anything, when you look up anywhere on the Vietnam War, unfortunately our history books focus on the demonstrations. They don't focus on what the Australian soldier positively achieved. And in some places, the images attached to articles are of Americans. So I don't think it will ever change, because where is the forum? The forum is this one. This is the only forum where the soldiers can put through their experience. And I hope out of that they will wonder that, well, these Australians were good, were tough and did it right. But I don't know whether that'll be... we did the right thing and it should be recognised. I think that's all we want, is that recognition we did it well.
Ian, thank you very much for being involved in the archive project.
So it does run a bit deep, doesn't it? I'm a very positive person, and that's what we must focus on, the positive aspects of the Australian involvement in Vietnam. And hopefully through the studies of the school that that's what will finally happen.